There was a man who built an entire empire with his bare hands only, to watch his only son snatch it all away and cast him out like an old dog. But they were wrong. Terribly wrong. If you are watching this story for the first time, hit subscribe now so you don't miss future gripping tales stories of betrayal, dignity, and the ultimate price paid in life. Hit like if you believe loyalty is more precious than gold, and comment with the city or country you're watching from so I know where in the world my stories are reaching. Don't go anywhere. The real story begins right now. I keep coming back to a single moment. Not the day my son told me to get out. Not the morning I woke up on a cot in that rotting shack with rain coming through a crack in the ceiling and no one in the world who knew or cared where I was. I keep coming back to a moment that happened years before any of that, a Tuesday afternoon in my office on the 14th floor of the Whitmore building. When Nathan was maybe 9 years old, and he climbed up into the chair across from my desk and watched me with those serious dark eyes and said, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be just like you." I remember smiling at him. I remember thinking, this is why I do it. This is what it's all for. I was wrong. I was wrong in ways I didn't have the language to understand yet. My name is Elias Whitmore. I'm 71 years old. I built Whitmore Capital from a single storefront loan office in Delwood, Ohio into a holding company with interests in commercial real estate, private lending, agricultural supply contracts, and 3 regional manufacturing plants. I did this over 43 years. I did it with my hands and my mind, and a stubbornness that my late wife, Carol, used to call the most exhausting thing about you. She wasn't wrong either. Carol died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, that's how fast it moved. And when she was gone, something in the architecture of my life cracked open in a way I never fully repaired. I'd built everything with her beside me. She'd kept the books for the first 12 years before we could afford a proper accountant. She'd answered phones. She'd talked me down off the ledge on 4 separate occasions when I was ready to fold and take a loss and walk away. After she died, the business kept running, because businesses do they have momentum, staff, contracts, quarterly obligations, but the man inside the business was not the same man. I leaned on Nathan more after Carol died. Maybe too much. Maybe that's part of my fault in all of this, and I've spent enough nights in that shack turning it over to know that I can't pretend otherwise. When you're grieving, and you're aging, and you're tired in the deepest part of your bones, you look for something solid to hold on to. Nathan was my son. He was the only real family I had left, so I held on. He was 34 when Carol passed. He'd been working inside the company for 6 years. By then started in the loan operations division, moved into acquisitions oversight. He was smart. Not the way I was smart, which was slow and methodical and built on getting burned enough times to learn what the fire felt like. Nathan was fast. He had instincts that felt almost theatrical, the kind of intelligence that impresses people in a conference room. Clients loved him. He could walk into a negotiation and read the room in 40 seconds. I admired that about him. I still do, even now, even after everything. What I didn't see, what I actively refused to see, if I'm being honest, was what happened to Nathan when he stopped being impressed by himself and started becoming entitled to himself. It was a gradual thing. It always is. The first sign was small enough that I talked myself out of it. About 8 months after Carol died, Nathan started pushing to restructure the management board. He wanted 2 of the senior directors' men who'd been with Whitmore Capital for over 15 years rotated out. His reasoning was fresh perspective. When I pressed him, he said the old guard was too risk-averse, too slow, too attached to my methods. I told him we'd revisit it in 6 months. He went quiet in the way that I would come to recognize as the particular silence of a man who's decided to be patient, because he believes time is on his side. 6 months later, he brought it up again and again. Over the following 2 years, those 2 directors were gone. So were 3 others I hadn't expected to lose. I told myself Nathan was modernizing. That's what you tell yourself when you want to believe in your child. Then came the conversation that changed everything. We were having dinner at my house, the house on Caldwell Road where Nathan had grown up, where he and his wife Diane came every Sunday, where my granddaughter Lily used to fall asleep on the couch after dessert, and Nathan would carry her to the car. It was a Sunday in March, about 3 years after Carol passed. The table was set the way Carol used to set it. I'd kept that habit, and Diane had brought a casserole, And Lily was telling me about a science project, and for a little while it felt close to the way things used to be. After Lily went to watch television, Diane excused herself to the kitchen, and Nathan sat back in his chair and looked at me the way he used to look at difficult numbers on a spreadsheet. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk about the succession plan." I wasn't surprised. It was overdue. "All right," I said. "What are you thinking?" "I think the timeline needs to move up. The board is concerned about continuity. There are a couple of the institutional investors who've quietly flagged that they're uncertain about the long-term structure without a clearer handoff." "Which investors?" He mentioned 2 names. Both were funds I'd cultivated personally over 20 years. "I'll talk to them," I said. "I've already talked to them," Nathan said. "They want to see a formal transition before the end of the fiscal year." That landed oddly. I looked at him. "You had conversations with them about my succession without telling me first." "I was trying to take something off your plate." "Nathan, those are my relationships. Those are relationships I built. And they're concerned, Dad." He kept his voice even measured. The conference room voice. "They're not trying to push you out. They just want assurance. And honestly," he paused, and in that pause was something I should have paid more attention to. "You've been tired, I see it. You don't have to keep carrying this the way you have been. You deserve to rest. You deserve to rest." At the time, I heard it as compassion. Looking back, I hear it differently. I hear it the way you hear a door being closed. "I'm not ready to hand over control of the company," I said. "Not full control. Just primary operational authority. You'd stay on the board. Advisory capacity." "Advisory capacity," I repeated. "In the company I founded, Dad." He leaned forward. His eyes were sincere. This is the part that still gets me the eyes. Nathan was never a cold person. That would have been easier to read. He was warm even when he was taking something from you. "You have nothing to prove. You've already done everything. Let me carry it now." I sat there at the table Carol used to set, in the house I'd owned for 31 years, and I looked at my son, and I felt something loosen inside my chest. Not in a good way. In the way a beam sounds when it starts to separate from the joint. "Give me until the end of summer," I said. "I'll have the attorneys draft something." Nathan nodded. He reached across the table and put his hand on mine. "Thank you, Dad. I have replayed that handshake 1,000 times. The transfer happened in October. I'd had Gerald Fitch, my attorney of 22 years, a man I trust with my actual life, draw up the documents. The structure was exactly what Nathan had described. Operational authority transferred to Nathan as Chief Executive Officer, with me retaining a seat on the advisory board and a nominal ownership interest in the parent holding entity. My personal assets, the house on Caldwell Road, my personal investment accounts, several parcels of land I'd acquired separately over the years under a different LLC remained entirely outside the transfer. This was Gerald's insistence, not mine. He'd looked at me across his desk with reading glasses on the end of his nose and said, "Elias, keep the personal holdings separate. Do not put them into this structure. I don't care how trustworthy your son is. He's my son, Gerald. I know who he is. Keep the holdings separate." I listened. I almost didn't, but I listened. The signing was quiet. Just Nathan, his attorney, Gerald, and me in a conference room on the 8th floor. Nathan shook Gerald's hand and then shook mine and said, "I won't let you down." His voice cracked very slightly when he said it. I thought, good. That crack means he understands what this is. For the first 4 months, I heard from him constantly. Updates, questions, decisions he wanted to run by me. It felt collaborative. It felt like what I'd hoped for. I went into the office twice a week. I had lunch with him on Thursdays. I came to Sunday dinners. The world looked, from where I was standing, more or less like the world I'd been promised. Then the Thursdays started getting canceled, then rescheduled, then canceled again. Then the Sunday dinners went every other week, then once a month. Then Diane would call and say Nathan was traveling, or Lily had a school thing, or they'd decided to go to her sister's for the weekend. I told myself he's busy. Running a company is demanding. I know this better than anyone, but a man knows. Even when he doesn't want to know, he knows. It was a Friday in January 14 months after the transfer when Nathan came to the house on Caldwell Road. He came alone, no Diane, no Lily. He was wearing a coat I didn't recognize, a dark wool one that looked expensive and new. He stood in my living room with his hands in his pockets, and he looked around the room in a way that felt like an appraisal. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Fine," I said. "Sit down." You want coffee? I can't stay long. He didn't sit. I wanted to talk to you about something. I waited. The board has been discussing the advisory structure, he said. And honestly, some of the investors feel like it creates ambiguity. Having you listed formally as an advisor but not operationally active sends mixed signals. What kind of mixed signals? About who's actually in charge. I looked at my son. Who is actually in charge? I am, he said. Not unkindly, just factually. That's the point. And my advisory role? He was quiet for a moment. We'd like to formalize your exit from that as well. You'd receive a structured annual payment through the holding company. Comfortable. You wouldn't have to think about any of it. You're removing me from the board, I said. We're restructuring the board. Yes. My hands were resting on my knees. I noticed they were very still. I've thought about that since how still my hands were, when everything else in my body was screaming. And the house, something shifted in his face, very briefly. What about it? This house, Nathan. Your mother and I raised you in this house. Is the board restructuring the house as well? He looked away, out the window toward the bare January yard. The property is technically held under an entity that was part of the original corporate structure, he said. Gerald may have set it up differently. I'd have to check with our legal team. But if it's inside the structures... It's not, I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Gerald made sure of that. Nathan's jaw tightened. Just barely, but I saw it. Right, then it's yours. No issue. But you'd already checked, I said. Before you came here today, you'd already checked to see if the house was inside the structure. He didn't answer. I stood up from my chair. I'm not a tall man, never was. But I stood up as straight as I could, and I looked at my son across the living room of the house, where I'd taught him to ride a bicycle, where he'd had his first nightmare, and come to our bed at 2 a.m, where I'd held his mother's hand and told her everything was going to be all right when both of us knew it wasn't. I stood up straight and I said, I think you should leave now. Dad, please leave. He left. I did not hear from Nathan for 11 days. On the 12th day, I received a formal letter from Whitmore Capital's legal department informing me that my advisory role had been dissolved, effective 30 days from the date of the letter. The letter was signed by Nathan in his capacity as Chief Executive Officer. I sat at my kitchen table and read it 3 times. Then I called Gerald Fitch. I know, Gerald said when he answered. He'd already received a copy. I've been waiting for your call. Talk to me. He can dissolve the advisory role. The transfer documents allowed for that. Unfortunately, my language wasn't airtight on that particular point, and I'm going to be angry about it for a long time. But the personal holdings are solid. The LLC structure is clean. He cannot touch the house. He cannot touch the investment accounts, and he absolutely cannot touch the parcels. He knew about the parcels? A beat. I don't know what he knows. But whatever he knows, he can't reach it. I exhaled. All right, Elias, what are you going to do? I looked around my kitchen. The curtains Carol had picked out. The crack in the tile near the back door that I'd always meant to fix. 40 years of a life sitting in objects. I'm going to think, I said, and then I'm going to act. What Nathan didn't know what he couldn't have known, because there were things I had never told him. Things Gerald and I had structured quietly and carefully over the better part of a decade, was that the inheritance he'd taken so triumphantly was not the whole picture, not even close. The real holdings, the ones that mattered most, the ones with the longest roots and the deepest value, were elsewhere. Hidden in plain sight, the way the most important things usually are. He thought he'd taken everything. He'd taken the part I was willing to give him. What happened next is where the story truly begins. 3 weeks after the letter, Nathan drove out to Caldwell Road again, this time with Diane. I saw the car pull up from the kitchen window, and I had enough time to understand, from the way they walked toward the front door, that this was not a social visit. Diane had always been polite to me. Careful. The kind of polite that keeps you at exactly the right distance. She stood in my living room in a coat that matched Nathan's and looked at the walls and the furniture and the photographs with the same appraising quality I'd seen in Nathan's face on his last visit. We've been thinking, Nathan began, about what makes sense going forward. For everyone. For everyone, I repeated. You don't need a house this size, Dad. It's a lot of upkeep. You're alone here. And frankly, he glanced at Diane in a way that felt rehearsed. We've been offered an opportunity to develop this property. There's a buyer who's very serious. I was quiet for so long that Diane said softly, Elias, this is meant to be good for you too. Is it? We'd find you something smaller, Nathan said. Easier to manage. Somewhere I could really what? He stopped. Finish the sentence, I said. Somewhere you could really relax. Be comfortable. You wouldn't have the burden of. This house is my home, I said. I am not selling it. I am not moving, and this conversation is over. Dad, I said, this conversation is over. Diane put her hand on Nathan's arm. He stood there for a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Then they left. That was in March. By May, my yard had been surveyed by a company I didn't authorize. I found the stakes in the ground along the property line on a Wednesday morning when I went out to check the garden. I called Gerald immediately. He's trying to establish a claim, Gerald said. It won't work, but he's trying. By June, my water pressure had dropped, and 2 calls to the service company went unreturned, though I later found out the account had been flagged under a billing dispute I hadn't initiated. By July, Nathan had stopped calling entirely. Diane sent a single text message. Dad, I hope you're doing well. Let us know if you need anything. I did not respond. What I did instead was drive out to a property I'd owned for 11 years under a quiet little LLC that didn't have my name anywhere visible on the registration documents. A piece of land on the eastern edge of Delwood County, where an old farmhand shack sat on 240 acres of land that 3 separate surveys had valued at something Nathan, in his confidence and his greed, had never thought to look for. I stood outside that shack in the July heat, and I looked at the cracked window and the sagging porch, and I made a decision. Nathan wanted me gone. He wanted me small and distant and out of his way. All right, I thought. Let him have that. Let him have that for exactly as long as it takes. I drove back to Caldwell Road, called Gerald, and said, start the work. Gerald said, start the work, and I said it back to him like a man who knows exactly what he means. And the truth is I did know. I'd known for longer than I was comfortable admitting, even to myself. The plan wasn't something I'd constructed overnight in a panic after Nathan dissolved my advisory role. It was something I'd been building quietly, the way you build a foundation below the surface, out of sight, load-bearing in ways nobody sees until the structure above it either stands or falls. But knowing what needed to be done and actually doing it are 2 different animals. And in those first weeks after I made the call to Gerald, I was still living on Caldwell Road, still sleeping in the house Carol and I had shared for 3 decades, still waking up at 5:30 in the morning the way I'd done my entire adult life, and making coffee in the same sonsat and in the same chair by the same window, looking out at the same yard. The surveyor's stakes were still in the ground at the property line. I'd pulled 2 of them up and thrown them in the trash, which was petty and probably pointless, but it felt necessary. I wasn't ready to leave the house, not yet. And I want to be honest about that, because I think people imagine that a man with a plan is a man who moves cleanly from one stage to the next, without looking back, without stumbling. It's not how it works. That's not how it worked for me. I sat in that kitchen for 3 weeks after calling Gerald, and I thought about Carol. I thought about what she would have said if she'd lived to see this. And I decided, finally, that what she would have said was, stop sitting in that chair and do something, Elias, before you drive yourself completely out of your mind. She had a direct quality that I have missed every single day since she left. In the second week of August, I had Gerald file the paperwork that transferred formal management of the Shack Properties LLC to an operating trust structure he and I had designed 2 years earlier for exactly this kind of moment, although at the time we'd both pretended politely that we were doing it for estate planning purposes, and not because I was quietly preparing for a war with my own son. The trust had provisions Gerald had spent considerable time on. Clean provisions, the kind that don't leave gaps. Then I did something that I suspect will sound either extremely calculated or extremely foolish, depending on who's hearing it. I called the real estate agent who'd left 3 voicemails for me over the previous 4 months. A call about the Caldwell Road property, the one Nathan had apparently pointed in my direction, and I told her I was ready to talk. I let her come to the house. I let her walk through every room with her clipboard and her measuring wheel and her careful professional enthusiasm. I offered her coffee. I listened to her tell me what the property was worth on the current market. I nodded at the right moments, and at the end of the visit, I shook her hand and told her I'd be in touch. I had no intention of selling. I needed Nathan to believe I was considering it. What I actually did the following week Call a property manager I'd used on 2 commercial buildings in the early 90s, a woman named Rosie Galvin, who was probably 65 now and still answered her own phone on the first ring, and ask her if she knew anyone reliable who handled residential leasing. You renting out Caldwell Road? She asked. Maybe, I said. What I need first is a good long-term tenant who moves in quietly and doesn't make the papers. Rosie was quiet for a moment. You're not actually leaving, are you? Rosie, you're setting something up. I'm making arrangements, I said. Can you help me or not? She could, she did. Within 3 weeks, she had a retired school teacher, a woman named Margaret Holloway, 68, quiet, no pets. Excellent references, ready to sign a 2-year lease on Caldwell Road at a below-market rate that would still cover the property taxes with money left over. I had a brief conversation with Margaret, in which I was as straightforward as I knew how to be. The house had been my family home for a long time. I was going to be away for a while dealing with some personal matters, and I needed someone trustworthy to live in it and maintain it. Margaret looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You don't have to explain yourself to me, Mr. Whitmore. I know what it looks like when a man's trying to hold on to something." I almost liked her on the spot. The day I loaded the last of my things into my truck was a Wednesday in late August. I moved slowly. I went through every room and I wasn't sentimental about it, or I tried not to be, and I wasn't entirely successful. I sat on the edge of the bed in the room Carol and I had shared, and I put my hand on the mattress and I didn't say anything out loud because there was nothing to say that felt adequate. Then I stood up, picked up the last bag, and walked out. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. Not because crying would have been weak, but because the thing I felt standing on that porch for the last time in a long while was not grief. It's something colder and cleaner. It was the feeling of a man who has made his decision and is past the point of second-guessing. I drove east out of town toward Delwood County, toward the shack on the 240 acres, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. The shack was worse than I'd remembered. I'd been out to check the property twice in the past year, but both times I'd stayed outside, walked the perimeter, looked at the land rather than the building. Now I stood inside it and did a slow assessment of what I was actually dealing with. The structure was a single-room farmhand's quarters from the 1950s, maybe 400 square feet, with an attached lean-to on the back that had been used as a utility space. The roof had held mostly, but there was soft rot in 2 of the floor joists near the north wall, and the window on the east side had a crack running from the lower left corner to the center that had let moisture in and caused a bloom of dark staining on the wall beside it. The plumbing worked barely. There was a bathroom the size of a generous closet. The water heater was original equipment, which is a kind way of saying it was a fire waiting for an invitation. The electrical panel was something Gerald had called charmingly vintage on the one occasion he'd been out here with me, by which he meant that it was a genuine hazard. I'd had a contractor out in June to do the worst of the structural work, the joists, the roof patching, a new water heater, updated panel. The contractor, a man named Del Purcell, who was about my age and came with no questions and good references, had done what I asked and kept it simple. The shack was now structurally sound. It was not comfortable. It was not anything approaching what I'd been used to. That was fine. That was in a way the point. I unloaded the truck, cot with a decent mattress I'd bought from a surplus store, 2-burner propane stove, a camp cooler until I could get a small refrigerator delivered, a folding table, 2 chairs, a lamp on an extension cord, and 6 boxes, 4 of files and documents, 1 of clothes, and 1 that held the things I couldn't leave at Caldwell Road, because they were the things that actually mattered, the things Nathan didn't know existed. I set up the cot along the south wall, positioned the lamp, and sat down on the edge of the cot in the gathering dark and looked at the 4 boxes of files, and I thought, this is what I have left. This is what's real. Then I thought, this is also enough. Word reached Nathan within 2 weeks. I knew it would. Delwood was not a large community, and I'd made no particular effort to hide my presence at the shack. What I was doing was not hiding. What I was doing was waiting. There's a difference, and it matters. Hiding is about fear. Waiting is about timing. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Nathan's name on my phone screen. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. Dad. His voice was tight. Not quite angry, something more controlled than anger, and somehow worse. What are you doing out at the Cutter Road property? I'd never told Nathan the address of the shack. He'd had someone looking. Living, I said. A silence. What do you mean, living? I mean, I'm living there. I've moved. You moved out of Caldwell Road. I did. Dad, that doesn't. He stopped, started again. That house is a shack. It doesn't even have proper heating. You can't live there. You're 71 years old. I'm aware of how old I am. This is another pause. I could hear him breathing and recalibrating. Did someone put you up to this? Did Gerald? Nathan. I kept my voice completely even. This was easier than I expected. I made a decision about where I wanted to live. It doesn't require your approval. It doesn't, Dad. I'm your son. I'm responsible for... You're not responsible for me, I said. You made that very clear. He was quiet for long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. Then what does that mean? It means exactly what it sounds like. You've taken over the company. You've removed me from the board. You've had surveyors on my property without my permission, and you sent a real estate agent to my door to try to get me to sell the house I raised you in. I think we've established pretty clearly where the boundaries of your responsibility lie. Those where that wasn't. His voice cracked, very slightly, and I recognized the crack. It was the same one from the day we signed the transfer documents. Except this time I heard it differently. This time I heard a man whose calculation was going wrong and who didn't yet know how wrong. Dad, I was trying to simplify things. For both of us. The house is too much for one person to maintain. And I've been what? Isolated. You've been isolating yourself. Have I? Yes. You don't come to Sunday dinner. You don't answer calls half the time. Nathan. I waited a beat. When did you last call me before today? Silence. When did you last invite me to Sunday dinner? When did Diane last call, not text? Call to actually ask how I was doing. When did you last drive out to Caldwell Road just to sit with me for an hour? No agenda, just to sit. I wasn't raising my voice. I didn't need to. You can answer any one of those questions you want. He didn't answer any of them. I'm fine where I am, I said. Tell Lily her grandfather says hello. I ended the call. I sat in the shack in the September afternoon light, on a folding chair at a folding table, with the cracked east window and the smell of old wood and dry grass coming through the gap under the door, and I felt this will sound strange. I felt something close to relief. The kind you feel when a pretense finally falls away. I'd spent 2 years pretending I didn't see what Nathan was doing. Pretending the silences were just busyness. Pretending the surveyor's stakes were a misunderstanding. Pretending the letter from his legal department was a formality rather than a declaration. The pretending had been exhausting in ways I hadn't fully recognized until I stopped doing it. I was done pretending. The weeks that followed were uncomfortable in the physical way and clarifying in every other way. September in Delwood County could be brutal, not with cold yet, but with the particular kind of damp heat that comes off the fields at night and settles into old buildings. I slept badly for the first 2 weeks. My back, which had been a moderate inconvenience for the past decade, became a persistent problem on the cot. I ate badly. I'd never been much of a cook. Carol had done the cooking, and after she died, I'd relied on a woman named Flora, who came 3 days a week to the house on Caldwell Road and left things in the refrigerator that I reheated without much thought. Out here it was soup from cans and sandwiches and whatever Del Purcell's wife, an unexpectedly warm woman named Bea, sometimes left on the porch in a covered dish with no note, because she'd apparently decided I needed feeding. I didn't ask for Bea's charity, and she didn't offer it as charity. It was simply left there, and I was simply grateful, and we never discussed it. And that was its own kind of human dignity that I didn't take for granted. What I did in those weeks, while my body adjusted to the discomfort, and my mind cleared itself of the noise of the previous 2 years, was work. I opened the 4 boxes of files. I spread documents across the folding table. I made calls, careful calls, to people whose numbers I'd kept for years and never used because I hadn't needed to yet. Gerald drove out twice, and we sat at the table with the documents between us, and we went over everything with the kind of attention that felt, by the end of each session, almost surgical. The picture that emerged from those documents, the real picture of what Elias Whitmore actually owned and controlled outside the walls of Whitmore Capital, was not what Nathan had imagined when he'd taken the company. I'm certain of that, because if he'd known what was in those boxes, he wouldn't have played it the way he played it. He was too smart for that. Whatever else Nathan was, he was not stupid. What he was incomplete. He'd made the mistake that arrogant people almost always make. He'd assumed that what he could see was everything there was to see. The parcels of land alone, 7 separate pieces of property across 3 counties, held under 2 different LLCs in names that had no obvious connection to Whitmore, anything, were worth more than the man who'd had them surveyed on Caldwell Road probably understood. 2 of them had been generating lease income from agricultural contracts for years, quietly, deposited into accounts that Nathan's legal team had never flagged because they'd never thought to look at the second tier of the holding structure. Gerald had designed it that way. Then there was the private lending portfolio. Not the institutional lending that had always been the visible backbone of Whitmore Capital, but a separate book of loans, 16 of them, held personally, many of them to businesses in the Delwood area that had needed capital at moments when the bank wouldn't move fast enough. Some of those loans had been made 20 years ago and had long since been repaid. But 6 of them were current. And one of them, one that Nathan almost certainly didn't know about because it predated his involvement in the company and had never been entered into the corporate books, was a loan to a man named Frank Deller, who ran a logistics company out of Hargrove and who owed, with interest and a deferred payment provision that had been quietly accumulating, a sum that would have made Nathan's jaw come off its hinges. And then there were the documents, the ones about Whitmore Capital's actual origins. This is where things get complicated, and where I have to be careful about how I say what I need to say. The company's public history, the story Nathan told investors, the story that appeared in the regional business profiles, the story Nathan himself had grown up hearing was substantially accurate, but it was not complete. There were early investors in Whitmore Capital, men who'd put in money before the company became anything, whose ownership stakes had been structured in a way that gave them very little visibility in the formal records, but very significant rights if certain conditions were ever triggered. These men were old now. One was dead. But the agreements they'd signed were still valid, and what those agreements said, if someone were to look at them carefully, was that any change in operational control of the company above a certain threshold required the consent of these original stakeholders, and that if that consent was not obtained, those stakeholders had certain remedies available to them that were, in Gerald's careful legal language, potentially significant. Nathan had transferred control of Whitmore Capital without obtaining that consent. He hadn't known to obtain it because he hadn't known the agreements existed. I hadn't told him. Gerald hadn't told him. We had not technically been obligated to tell him at the time of the transfer because the obligation ran in the other direction. It was the party receiving control who was responsible for conducting due diligence. Nathan had not conducted due diligence. He'd been too confident to think he needed to. I want to be clear about what I was doing with this information. I was not at that point planning to blow up the company. I'd spent 43 years building it. It employed over 300 people, most of whom had nothing to do with my son's decisions. Burning the whole thing down to punish Nathan was not something I was willing to do. I am not that kind of man, and I was not willing to become that kind of man just because someone had hurt me. What I was planning was more precise than that. And it required one more piece I didn't have yet, and wouldn't have until Nathan provided it to me himself. He called again in October. Twice, actually once on a Tuesday that I let go to voicemail, and once on a Thursday when I answered. The voicemail was Nathan in his careful business voice, saying he hoped I was doing well, and that Lily had asked about me, and that maybe we could find a time to have dinner. I listened to it twice and then deleted it. The Thursday call was different. Dad. He skipped the pleasantries. We need to discuss the Cutter Road property. What about it? The LLC that holds it there are questions about the entity's relationship to some of the corporate structures that were part of the transfer. Our legal team wants to take a closer look. I'd expected this eventually. It had taken longer than I thought it would. The LLC has nothing to do with the corporate structures from the transfer, I said. Gerald can send documentation confirming that. Our team feels they need to review it directly. Your team can feel whatever they want, I said. They don't have the right to review my personal holdings. Dad, a shift in his tone. Softer. The voice I'd trusted for 30 years. I'm not trying to make this adversarial. I'm just trying to sort out what belongs where. For everyone's benefit. Nathan, I said. We've been in this conversation before with different words. And the answer is the same as it's always been. What is mine is mine. I kept it separate because Gerald is very good at his job, and because on some level that I don't enjoy acknowledging, I think I always knew this conversation might happen. A long silence. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm not angry at you, I said. And the strange thing was, in that moment, I wasn't. I was something beyond anger. On the other side of it, a place where I could see my son clearly, without the distortion that love and proximity create. And what I saw was a man who had made choices he would have to live with. It means I hope you're keeping your own records very carefully, because there are aspects of the transfer you may not have fully examined. I'd suggest you have someone look at the original partnership agreements from the early years of the company, the ones from before you were involved. Another silence. Longer. What original partnership agreements? Have someone look, I said. It would be worth your time. I didn't say anything else. And neither, for a moment that stretched long enough to tell its own story, did Nathan. Dad, tell Lily I love her, I said. Good night, Nathan. I won't pretend the days were easy after that. I'm telling this honestly, or I'm not telling it at all. And honestly means saying that there were mornings in that shack when the damp had gotten into the walls overnight, and the single-bar electric heater I'd picked up at the hardware store barely took the edge off, and I woke up stiff and cold and 60 miles from anyone I'd shared a meal with in months. And I sat on the edge of that cot and thought, is this worth it? And then I'd make coffee on the 2-burner stove, and I'd open the box with the documents, and I'd look at what was in there, the real picture, the complete picture, and the answer would reassemble itself. Yes, it was worth it. Because what Nathan had taken from me was not just a company. It was not just the comfortable life I'd earned over 40 years. What Nathan had taken, or tried to take, was the idea that I was finished. The idea that an old man who'd handed over the keys was now simply waiting for the end, manageable and ignorable and easily relocated to a smaller space where his opinions and his past and his knowledge of things Nathan didn't know wouldn't create inconvenience. He'd tried to reduce me to a number on a severance structure, a line item in a reorganization. I had no intention of being a line item. Del Purcell came by on a Friday morning in mid-October with a truckload of firewood he hadn't been asked to bring, and stacked it under the lean-to without saying much beyond, "You'll want this in another few weeks." Then he stood in the doorway and looked at the table full of documents and didn't ask what they were, and I told him he was welcome to come in for coffee, and he did. He was the kind of man who talks slowly and means what he says. He'd worked this land in his youth, he told me. His father had worked it before that. He knew every feature of those 240 acres in a way that took a lifetime. You know what this land was worth before the Eastern Bypass came through? He asked. I have an idea, I said. He named a figure. Then he named the figure it was worth now, since the bypass has opened up the county corridor, and 3 distribution centers had gone in within 12 miles. Yeah, I said, I know. Del looked at me across his coffee cup for a moment. Your son doesn't know, does he? It wasn't quite a question. No, I said, he doesn't. Del nodded slowly, the way older men nod when something confirms what they already figured. What happens when he finds out? I looked out the cracked east window at the flat October fields. Light going gray and low, at 4 in the afternoon, the land stretching out farther than you'd think from the road. My land, paid for quietly, held quietly, grown quietly over 11 years, while Nathan was busy inheriting a company. He finds out when I'm ready for him to find out, I said. Del drank his coffee. He didn't ask anything else. He finished his cup, said goodbye to me without making anything of it, and drove back down the road toward his own property. And I sat there in the cooling afternoon and looked at those documents, and I thought about Nathan, and about what the next few months were going to bring, and about what kind of man I was going to be when the moment finally came. The moment was coming. I could feel it the way you feel weather not seeing it yet, but knowing it's building somewhere past the edge of your line of sight, and knowing that when it breaks, it's going to break hard. Nathan had no idea how bad his numbers had gotten since he'd taken over the company. He was burning through cash in ways I recognized from the outside, the visible moves of a man trying to look large while the foundation under him was shifting. The board he'd restructured had none of the old guard's conservatism and all of the new blood's appetite for risks. 3 acquisitions in 14 months, 2 of which I'd have turned down in the first conversation. A lending portfolio that had drifted toward exposure in a real estate segment that was already showing softness. He was good at making things look solid. He'd always been good at that. But I'd built this business. I knew the difference between solid and the appearance of solid. I knew what the numbers looked like from the inside when the margin started to compress and the quarterly story stopped matching the quarterly reality. And I knew because Gerald had quietly maintained access to certain reporting structures that Nathan's legal team had not thought to revoke, that Whitmore Capital's actual position was beginning to diverge from its public position in ways that were not yet visible to the people who needed to be worried about it. It was late October when I got the call that told me the waiting was almost over. Not from Nathan. From one of the original investors, an 81-year-old man named Arthur Greer, who lived in Columbus and who had, apparently, received a visit from someone at Whitmore Capital's new legal team asking about his role in the company's founding. They didn't know what they were looking for, Arthur told me. His voice still carried the dry precision of a man who'd spent 40 years in contract law. They knew enough to find the agreements, but they couldn't read what they meant. They thought they were cleaning up old paperwork. What did you tell them? I told them the agreements were valid and binding, and that they might want to have someone look at them more carefully before they said another word to me. And then I called you, Arthur said. Because I figure if someone's been sniffing at the foundation, the owner of the house probably wants to know. He does, I said. He very much does. I thanked Arthur and ended the call and sat for a moment in the particular silence of the shack. At night, no traffic. No neighbors, just the wind off the fields and the occasional complaint from the old building's joints as the temperature dropped. And I felt the whole thing coming into alignment the way a long calculation finally resolves when the last variable drops into place. Nathan had found the agreements. He didn't understand them yet. He would. And when he did, when he finally grasped what those agreements meant, and what the land on Cutter Road was worth, and what Frank Deller's deferred loan represented, and what the true picture of his situation actually looked like, there was only one place he was going to go. He was going to come here, to this shack, to the old man he'd written off and discarded and tried to turn into a manageable inconvenience. He was going to come here because there was nowhere else left, and I was going to be ready. Arthur Greeter's call had told me the clock was running, not ticking running. There's a difference in the pace of a thing when you know the other side has started to realize what they're dealing with. And what I felt in the days after that conversation was not patience, so much as a coiled kind of readiness. The feeling of a man standing at the edge of a high board who has already decided to jump and is simply waiting for the right moment to leave his feet. November came in cold and flat across the Delwood County fields. The firewood Dell had stacked under the lean-to was already earning its keep. I'd gotten the small electric space heater working more reliably after Dell's son, a quiet 18-year-old named Marcus, who came out twice with his father, and never said much but was apparently gifted with anything mechanical, rewired the outlet. It ran from and replaced a corroded junction box that had been quietly throttling the current. The shack was still uncomfortable in the way that old buildings with inadequate insulation are always uncomfortable, which is to say that warmth was something you had to work for and maintain rather than something that simply existed. I'd adjusted. Old men adjust or they don't, and I hadn't come this far to stop adjusting now. I was sleeping better by then. My back had reached a truce with the cot. I ate more carefully than I had in the first weeks B. Purcell had, without any discussion. Begun leaving covered dishes with enough regularity that I'd started leaving the empty ones on her porch in return. Washed with a note of thanks tucked under the lid. Small dignities. They matter more than people think. Gerald drove out on the first Thursday of November, with a folder that was thicker than his usual folders, which were already not thin. He set it on the folding table between us and opened it, and didn't say anything for a moment. Just let me look at what was on top. It was a copy of a notice that Whitmore Capital's legal team had filed with the county recorder's office. A preliminary claim related to the Cutter Road Properties LLC, arguing that the entity had been improperly excluded from the corporate transfer. They filed this 4 days ago, Gerald said. I looked at it. Read it twice. How strong is it? About as strong as wet cardboard, Gerald said. But it's filed, which means they're escalating, which means someone over there has figured out enough to be scared and not enough to know they're already outgunned. Nathan know you'd see this immediately? Gerald took off his reading glasses and cleaned them on his tie, which was a habit he had when he was choosing his words. Nathan's legal team is good. They're fast and they're aggressive. And they don't make many procedural mistakes. But they're corporate transaction attorneys, Elias. They're very good at what they're designed for. He gestured at the folder. This isn't what they're designed for. This is a property dispute with a founding agreement overlay and a trust structure they haven't fully mapped yet. They're operating on incomplete information, and they know it. And filing this notice is what you do when you need to establish a position before you've finished doing your homework. So they're stalling. They're positioning, which is a more aggressive version of stalling. He put his glasses back on. It also tells us something else. I waited. The fact that they filed this at all means Nathan's situation is more urgent than the public picture suggests. You don't file aggressive, preliminary claims against your own father's private property unless you need what's on the other end of that claim. The land, the LLC assets, or both. Gerald folded his hands on the table. I've been watching the public filings for Whitmore Capital for the past 6 weeks. The debt structure on those 2 acquisitions from last spring is worse than the quarterly reports indicate. They've done some creative restructuring of the payment timelines to keep it off the top-line numbers, but it's there if you know what you're looking for. How bad? Gerald was quiet for a moment. Not hesitant, Gerald was almost never hesitant. More like he was giving the weight of what he was about to say its proper space. If nothing changes in the next 4 to 6 months, Whitmore Capital will be in technical default on 2 of its major credit facilities. And once that triggers, the cascading effect on the other structures won't be pretty. I sat with that. The company I had built for 43 years. 300 and some employees, a regional institution that had outlasted recessions and bad markets, and 3 complete cycles of the county's economy. And my son, in less than 2 years, had driven it to the edge of a cliff. I won't pretend I felt nothing. I felt a great deal. But I want to be careful about what I say here, because it would be easy and dishonest to tell you I felt only righteous anger, the clean, simple anger of a man who was wronged and is now watching karma do its work. That's not what I felt. What I felt was more complicated than that, the way most true things are. I felt grief underneath the anger. Grief for the company, grief for the people who worked there, grief for the version of Nathan I'd watched grow up and had believed in. Grief for the thing I'd spent my whole working life building and had apparently trusted to the wrong hands. And beneath the grief, something else. Something I can only call resolve. Not the hot kind, not the kind that makes you do something reckless. The cold kind. The kind that has a plan already in place and is simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. What do we do about the filing? I asked. We respond, Gerald said. We respond clearly, completely, and in a way that demonstrates exactly how clean the LLC structure is. And we attach the founding trust documents and the transfer records, and we make it so thoroughly clear that this claim has no legal basis that their own attorneys have to tell Nathan to drop it. And the founding partnership agreements? Arthur Greer? Gerald allowed himself a small, tight expression that was as close to satisfaction as he usually got. I've spoken with Arthur and with the estate representative for the 3rd original stakeholder. They're both prepared to formally assert their rights under the original agreements if it becomes necessary. If Nathan's legal team hasn't worked out what those agreements actually say yet, they're about to. When do we send them? I'd like to wait 1 more week, Gerald said. I want to see if they escalate further before we show everything. If we respond to the county filing now, they'll know we've been monitoring it and they'll recalibrate. I'd rather let them move once more before we lay out the whole picture. I nodded. Gerald was a careful man, and his carefulness had never once cost me anything I wasn't willing to pay. 1 week, I said. He drove back to town, and I sat at the folding table in the November afternoon and looked at the copy of the filing and thought about Nathan sitting in my office, the office. That was now his office. The office on the 14th floor of the Whitmore building. Reading reports that didn't tell the whole truth, making calls to attorneys who were very good at what they were designed for and not good enough for this, and slowly beginning to understand that the old man he'd written off was not as written off as he'd believed. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The second call from Nathan came on a Saturday. Not a weekday business call, a Saturday, which told him something had broken through the professional exterior. When Nathan called on a Saturday, it meant something had gotten past the managed presentation he maintained during the week. I answered on the second ring, Dad. His voice was different from the October call. Tighter, like something was wound too hard inside it. I need to talk to you. You're talking, I said. Not like this. In person. A pause. Can I come out there? The shack on Cutter Road. He wanted to come to the shack. I'd been waiting for this, and I still felt the weight of it when it came. Tomorrow afternoon, I said. 2 o'clock. He arrived at 1:45. I'd half expected Diane or an attorney, but he came alone, which told me something too. He parked the car on the gravel strip beside the shack and sat in it for a moment before getting out, which I saw through the east window. Then he got out and stood and looked at the shack, the way people look at things they're trying to reconcile with what they expected, and then he walked to the door and knocked, which was something I hadn't anticipated, that he would knock. I opened the door. The look on his face when he stepped inside was something I have thought about many times since. Not pity, exactly, though there was an element of that. Something more complicated, surprise maybe, or the particular discomfort of a person confronted with the concrete reality of a choice they'd made in the abstract. The shack was what it was. Small, spare, lit by the lamp on the extension cord, and what came through the 2 windows. The folding table with its organized files, the cot along the south wall, 2-burner stove, the cooler that had been replaced by a small refrigerator by then, Dell's firewood stacked neat through the back. The photographs I'd put up on the wall above the cot, 3 of them. One of Carol and me at the lake house the summer, before she got sick. One of Lily at about 4 years old sitting on my shoulders in the backyard at Caldwell Road, and one of the Whitmore building taken from the street on the day we opened it, 1989, with me standing in front of it looking approximately 60 years younger and considerably more reckless. Nathan looked at the photographs. His face did something I didn't fully catch before he controlled it. "Sit down," I said. He sat in the second folding chair. I stayed standing for a moment, then sat across from him. We looked at each other across the table with its organized files, and for a few seconds neither of us said anything. "You look thin," Nathan said. "I'm fine, Dad. This place—" "Nathan," I said it quietly. "Don't," he stopped. Looked at his hands for a moment, then looked up. The legal team found some documents. Old agreements from the early years of the company. "I know." He blinked. "You know they found them. I expected they would eventually. I'm surprised it took this long, frankly. The agreements are in the standard corporate archive." There, he stopped. Chose his next words the way a man chooses his footing on uncertain ground. "They're more complicated than anything I was aware of. The team is saying they have significant implications for the transfer structure." "They do," I said. "Yes." He stared at me. "You knew about them when we did the transfer. I founded the company with 2 other men, Nathan. Of course I knew about them. You didn't disclose them. The obligation to conduct due diligence on existing agreements ran to you as the party receiving operational control. Gerald made that clear in the transfer documentation. You had a 90-day review period before the transfer finalized. Your legal team at the time didn't request the founding documents, because we didn't know to request them. That's not my responsibility," I said. "And I want to be clear, this wasn't cruelty. It was simply the truth, stated plainly. Nathan, if I were buying a business from someone, I would ask to see every document related to that business's founding and operating history. Wouldn't you?" He was quiet. "Your team didn't ask. I didn't withhold. I simply didn't volunteer information that wasn't requested in a transaction where the requesting party had full legal authority and $60 million worth of professional advisory support. I kept my voice even. Those are the facts." His jaw tightened. "What do those agreements actually mean? For the company, you should have your attorneys explain it to you. I'm asking you. I know you are." I looked at him steadily. "I'll explain it to you. The original partnership agreements from 1983 gave the founding investors, myself, Arthur Greer, and Dale Whitfield, consent rights over any transfer of operational control above a 50% threshold. Arthur is still alive and still legally represented. Dale passed away 6 years ago, but his estate representative holds the same rights. Transfer of the nature and scope of ours without their consent triggers a remedies clause that gives them the right to seek a reversal of the transfer, or, alternatively, a negotiated settlement to release those rights." Nathan's face had gone carefully still, the way a person's face goes still when the blood has dropped out of it. A reversal of the transfer. That's one of the remedies available, yes. They would do that? Arthur Greer is 81 years old and spent his career as a contract attorney. He's not a sentimental man. He is a man who takes his agreements very seriously. I paused. I've spoken with him. The silence that followed was the longest one in any conversation we'd had in years. Nathan sat across from me in the folding chair, and I watched the thing he was processing move through his face in stages, the way weather moves disbelief first, then a kind of rapid internal recalculation, then something that was very close to fear. He was good at controlling his face, my son. He'd learned that from years of conference rooms, but some things are too large to fully contain. "What do you want?" he said finally. His voice was quieter than I'd heard it in a long time. Almost small. "I want to talk," I said. "That's all I've ever wanted, Nathan. To talk honestly. We're talking." "No. We've been negotiating. We've been positioning. That's different from talking." I leaned forward slightly. "I want to tell you some things. About the company. About what I know. About what you don't know. And I want you to listen. Not as a CEO. Not as the man who signed the transfer documents. As my son." He looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, a very slight softening that he may not have been aware of. "All right," he said. "The company is in trouble," I said. "I don't mean moderate trouble. I mean that the debt exposure on the Hargrove and Meridian acquisitions, combined with the current performance of the restructured lending portfolio, puts Whitmore Capital in a position where it will be in technical default on 2 credit facilities within the next 6 months, if the trajectory doesn't change." Nathan's stillness was absolute. "I've been watching the public filings," I said. "Gerald has access to certain internal reports that your team didn't revoke when they removed me from the advisory board and oversight. Not a deliberate one, I assume, but it means I've had a clearer picture of the numbers than you probably realize." I kept my voice steady. No satisfaction in it, because this was not a satisfying thing. This was my company. The 2 board members you kept from my original structure, Harrison and Park, have been raising these concerns internally for 4 months. I know this because Harrison called me 2 months ago. He didn't tell me what to do with the information. He just needed someone who would understand what he was describing. For the first time, something cracked through Nathan's composure. Not anger, shame. It showed up in a slight tightening around his eyes and a movement of his jaw that he stopped before it became anything visible. "Harrison called you. He was worried. He's been with the company for 18 years. He didn't know what else to do. He went around me to call my father. He went to the founder of the company," I said, "because the current leadership wasn't hearing what he was saying." I looked at Nathan directly. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because the situation is real and the timeline short. And the choices you make in the next 60 to 90 days will determine whether the company survives this or doesn't." "And the partnership agreements," Nathan said. His voice had recovered some of its steadiness, but it was a different kind of steady, the kind that costs something. "If Arthur Greer exercises those remedies, it would be very bad," I said. "Yes." The remedies clause was written by a contract attorney in 1983 who was being deliberately expansive. If Arthur and Dale's estate chose to pursue it fully, it would tie the company in litigation at exactly the moment you can least afford litigation. The institutional investors who are already uncertain about the company's direction would have grounds for review clauses of their own. It would be, I paused. It could be the end of Whitmore Capital as a going concern. Nathan was quiet. Outside, the November wind pushed against the shack's walls in that low, persistent way it had, and the lamp on the extension cord did its small job of making the room habitable. And between us on the folding table were the files that represented everything I'd been carrying since August. I watched my son sitting in a folding chair in a shack on land he hadn't known existed, in a situation he hadn't seen coming, and I felt the weight of everything between us. "Why are you telling me this?" Nathan asked. I didn't answer immediately because the question deserved a real answer and not a quick one. "Because you're my son," I said. "Because I built that company, and there are 300 people who work there who have nothing to do with what's happened between us. Because your mother loved you and would have wanted me to tell you the truth before the situation became unrecoverable." I looked at him steadily. "And because I am not interested in destroying you, Nathan. I never was. That was never what this was about." "Then what was it about?" "You tell me," I said. He looked away. Out the east window with its repaired crack, at the November fields going gray in the afternoon light. He looked for a long time without saying anything, and I let him look. "I thought you were slowing down," he said finally. "I thought you were. I told myself you couldn't run it anymore, that you were holding it back, that the company needed to move faster than you were willing to let it move. And he was quiet, Nathan. My voice was still quiet. But there was something underneath it now, a firmness that was not anger, but was not soft either. And I wanted it, he said. Just that. 3 words. No elaboration and none needed. The plainness of it was almost startling after years of careful language and managed presentation. I wanted it. I'd been working inside it for 10 years, and I wanted it to be mine, and I told myself stories about why it made sense for it to happen now, and about you slowing down and the company needing fresh direction, and I believed the stories while I was telling them. He turned back from the window. His eyes were dry, but something in them was raw in a way I hadn't seen since he was very young. I don't know that I believe them as much now. I didn't fill the silence that followed. I let it sit there between us because it was the first honest thing he'd said to me in 2 years, and it needed space to mean something. What happened to the Hargrove acquisition? I asked after a while. Practical. Back to the ground, he exhaled, ran a hand through his hair. The market softened faster than the projections accounted for. The debt service assumptions were based on a 12-month ramp that hasn't materialized. He was talking about it, now, the way you talk about something you've been not talking about for too long quickly, with relief under the words. The board pushed back in September, but by then the deal was already closed. Meridian is the same problem, different sector. Both at the same time as he stopped. Is a crisis, I said. Yes. Have you told the institutional investors the full picture? No, Nathan. I know. He pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. I know. We've been working on a remediation plan. There's a path out of this, but it requires liquidity that we don't currently have, and the asset sale options are either too slow or too visible. Too visible meaning they'd signal the problem to the market. Yes. I looked at him for a moment. Frank Deller. His eyes came up sharply. What? Frank Deller, the logistics company in Hargrove. He has a note with me, a personal loan, outside the corporate structure, that has been accumulating on a deferred payment provision for the past 9 years. I watched Nathan's face. He doesn't know it, but that note comes due for renegotiation at the end of this fiscal year. And the land on Cutter Road, the 240 acres we're sitting on right now, has been appraised at 3 times what you'd guess because of the Eastern Bypass development and the distribution corridor. Nathan was very still. I also have 6 current loans in my private portfolio outside the company, outside structure you have access to, totaling an amount that would cover the short-term liquidity gap on the Hargrove position if it were made available on the right terms. Dad, his voice had dropped, almost a whisper. Why are you telling me this? I'm not telling you I'm going to do those things, I said clearly. I'm telling you I have the capacity to do them. I'm telling you that the old man you sent to a shack in the county because you thought he was finished and powerless is not finished and not powerless. I want you to understand that fully, Nathan. Not as a threat, as a fact. Can you hear the difference? He looked at me for a long time. The longest he'd looked at me directly in 2 years. Yes, he said quietly. I can hear it. I stood up, went to the 2-burner stove and put the kettle on because it was November, and the room was cold, and some things are simply practical. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think before you answer. All right. Why did you have surveyors on the Caldwell Road property in the spring? He was quiet. And why did you send that real estate agent to my door? And why did your legal team file a claim on the Cutter Road LLC 4 days ago when they don't have enough information to support that claim, and Gerald will dismantle it in 36 hours? I turned from the stove. Why, Nathan? Not the business reason. The real reason. His hands were on the table. He looked at them. I needed the assets, he said. I was trying to find liquidity before the situation became. That's the business reason. He was silent. Why your father's house, I said. Why the property your father is living on? Why not an asset sale? Why not a bridge loan? Why not a dozen other options that didn't require coming after what's mine? Because stop. Because it was easier, I said. Not harshly, just clearly. Because I was your father, and you'd already convinced yourself I was finished, and it's easier to take something from someone you've written off than to solve a problem with your own resources. I kept my eyes on him. And because somewhere in you believed I would let you. Because I'd let you do everything else. Nathan's jaw worked. He wasn't going to cry, that wasn't Nathan's way, but something in the set of his face was different from anything I'd seen before. Something had broken through the conference room's surface, and what was underneath it was younger and less certain and closer to the boy who'd sat in the chair across from my desk at 9 years old and said he wanted to be just like me. I was wrong, he said. The words came out like they had weight, like saying them cost him something real. About the surveys, about the agent, about a lot of it. Yes, I said. You were. The kettle started, and I made 2 cups of coffee instant, the best I could do on a 2-burner stove in a shack in November, and I put one in front of Nathan and sat back down with mine. And we sat there across from each other in the small lamplit room, with the wind at the walls and the photographs on the south wall watching us. Carol at the lake, Lily on my shoulders, the Whitmore building in 1989. I need to ask you something else, I said, and this one's harder. Nathan wrapped both hands around the cup. Ask it. Do you understand now why I kept things separate? Why Gerald structured my personal holdings the way he did? Why I didn't put everything into the transfer? A long pause. You knew, Nathan said slowly. Not that I would do this specifically, but you knew something. I didn't know. I hoped I was wrong. But I built this business by being honest about risk, and the risk was there. I looked at my son. Gerald told me to keep the holdings separate before I ever had any reason to think you'd come after them. And the part of me that understood risk, the part that built 43 years of this company, by reading what might go wrong, that part of me listened. I didn't want to listen. I wanted to believe that the fact that you were my son was enough. It should have been, Nathan said, very quietly. Yes, I said. It should have been. We sat with that for a while. Outside, the light was going. In Delwood County in November, the dark came early and completely, no city lights to soften it, just the fields and the sky. What happens now? Nathan asked. Now we figure out whether there's a version of this where the company doesn't go under, I said. And whether there's a version of this where you and I can be honest with each other. Not the managed version of honest, the actual version. And the partnership agreements? Arthur Greer? Arthur Greer does what I ask him to do, I said. He has for 30 years. I'm not going to ask him to bring down the company, Nathan. I told you that was never what this was about. Then what was it about? He asked again. The same question as before, but asked differently, not defensively. With something that might, if I was reading it right, have been a genuine desire to understand. It was about making sure, I said, that when you finally came to this table, this actual table, this folding table in a shack on land you didn't know I had, that you came here knowing I wasn't powerless. That you came here because you chose to, not because you had no other option. I met his eyes. Did you choose to come here today, Nathan? Or did you come because you'd run out of road? Question sat in the air between us for a long time. Nathan looked at his coffee cup, then at the photographs on the south wall, then back at me. And when he answered, the careful voice was gone entirely, the conference room voice, the CEO voice, the voice that had been managing me and everyone else for 2 years. What was left was something quieter and less certain and more real. Both, he said. Both things were true. I'm not going to lie to you about that. It wasn't the answer I'd wanted, but it was the truest thing he'd said since he'd arrived. And I'd spent enough of my life learning the difference between what I wanted to hear and what I actually needed to hear, to know that the true thing, even when it was harder, was always worth more. All right, I said. Both. I can work with both. Outside, the dark had finished arriving. The lamp on the extension cord did its small, consistent job. The fire in the lean-to was settled into a low, even burn. Nathan sat across from me in the shack on Cutter Road with both hands around his coffee cup, and for the first time in 2 years looked like a man who wasn't managing anything, just a man. Tired and uncertain, and sitting in his father's house, which happened to be a shack, because that's where his father was. We talked for 3 more hours that night. Not about everything, there was too much for one night. We talked about the company, about the numbers, which were bad, and needed to be addressed before they became catastrophic. About Harrison and Park, and what they'd been trying to say that wasn't being heard. About Frank Deller's note, and what could be done with it. About the Cutter Road land, and what it was actually worth, and what Nathan's face looked like when I told him the full appraised value. Which is a look I won't describe in detail, except to say it was a thorough education in the cost of assumptions. I did not offer him anything that night. I want to be clear about that. I did not promise help. I did not promise resources. I did not promise any particular outcome. What I offered was information and a conversation. Those 2 things are not nothing often. They're everything, but they were not a rescue. And I was not in the business of rescuing Nathan, from consequences of his own making. What I was in the business of was something more complicated, and in the end, more important than rescue. I was in the business of making sure that whatever happened next, it happened on honest terms, between two people, a father and a son, who finally, after 2 years of positioning and pretense and careful managed distance, were sitting in the same room telling each other the truth. When Nathan finally stood to leave, it was past 9 o'clock. He put on his coat and looked around the shack. One more time, the lamp, the cot, the photographs, and his face did the thing it had done when he first walked in, the thing he almost controlled, but not quite. "You didn't have to live like this," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something more like grief. "I know," I said. "I chose to." He looked at me. Why I thought about it. Gave him the honest answer, which was the only kind I had left. Because this gestured at the shack, at the table, and the files, and the bare walls. This made it clear. Living here made it clear who I was and what I actually had. Not the house on Caldwell Road, not the company, not the advisory title, or the conference room on the 14th floor. This I put my hand flat on the folding table. What's on this table is what's real. And I needed to know that. I needed to sit with it until I was certain of it. Nathan stood at the door. He looked at his father, a small, 71-year-old man in a shack in Delwood County, and something moved through his face that I can only call recognition. The kind that arrives late and costs something and can't be unfelt once it's there. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. "I'll answer," I said. He went out and I heard the car start, and I sat back down at the folding table and looked at the documents and the photographs and the doing its small job, and I breathed in the cold wood smell of the shack, and I was not happy. Happy is too simple a word for what that night held. But I was something. Something that had weight to it, something that felt like the ground coming back under your feet after a long time of feeling like you were walking on air. The next move was Nathan's. And for the first time in 2 years, I believed he understood the stakes well enough to make it honestly. He called the next morning at 8:47. I know the time because I'd been up since 5:30, the way I always was, and I'd been sitting at the folding table since 6, with the documents open and a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow, not reading, just thinking. Running the previous night through my mind the way you run a river through your hands, trying to feel where the current was strong, and where it was shallow, and where there might be something sharp beneath the surface you hadn't expected. Nathan called at 8:47, and I answered on the first ring. "I couldn't sleep," he said. No preamble. Just that. "I know the feeling," I said. "I've been thinking about what you said. About Harrison. About the debt structure." He paused. "I've been thinking about all of it." Another pause. Longer. The kind that means a person is deciding how far to go. "I think I need to bring the full picture to the board. The real numbers. Not the managed version." I waited. This was not a small thing he was saying. For a man who'd spent 2 years managing the presentation, deciding to stop managing it was the kind of decision that couldn't be unmade. Once you tell the truth about a bad situation, you can't untell it. The consequences of honesty are permanent in a way that the consequences of concealment aren't, which is one of the reasons concealment is so tempting and so corrosive. "That's the right call," I said. "It's going to be bad," Nathan said. "When they see the full picture. Some of them are going to want to remove me. Some of them might," I said honestly. "That's a real possibility." "I know." His voice was steady, but it was a different kind of steady than the conference room voice. More effortful. Like a man carrying something heavy and not trying to make it look lighter than it was. "I also think I need to talk to you about the partnership agreements. I need to understand what your intention is there. I'm not asking you to promise anything. I just need to understand where we stand." "Where we stand," I said, "is that I have no intention of directing Arthur Greer to pursue the remedies clause. But that's my current intention. And intentions aren't guarantees. And what keeps my current intention in place is whether this conversation we started last night continues or whether it stops." I let that settle for a moment. "I'm not threatening you. I'm being clear with you. Those are two different things." "I understand the difference," Nathan said. "Good. Then let's talk about Frank Deller." Frank Deller ran Deller Logistics out of a facility on the east side of Hargrove. I'd known Frank for 26 years. We'd met at a county business development forum in the mid-90s when Frank was 32 years old and running routes out of a 2-truck operation and trying to find financing that the regional banks wouldn't touch because his collateral was too thin. and his track record too short. I'd written him a personal loan that year, not through the company, out of my own pocket, because I'd looked at his books and his operation, and I'd seen something in the way he talked about logistics that told me this was a man who understood the business he was in at a cellular level. 26 years later, Frank's company employed 84 people and moved freight across 7 states. The original loan had been repaid 3 times over, and the deferred second note, a larger amount, written in 2008, when Frank was expanding his fleet and the banks had locked up after the financial crisis, had been sitting on a deferred payment structure for 9 years, accumulating at a rate we'd agreed on together. That note, renegotiated at current terms, was substantial. And Frank Deller was a man who paid what he owed, which I knew because he'd been trying to renegotiate the deferred structure for the past 3 years, and I'd kept telling him we'd get to it. The truth was I'd been keeping it in reserve, not out of any calculation against Nathan, not then, not when I first started keeping it, but because Frank's note was part of the private portfolio that represented my actual financial foundation, the one Carol and I had built piece by piece outside the company, and I handled it on my own timeline. The timeline had arrived. I called Frank that afternoon. He answered on the second ring. Frank was a 2-ring answer kind of man, disciplined about communication in the way that people who run logistics operations tend to be. Elias. His voice carried the warmth of a man who is genuinely glad to hear from someone. I've been meaning to call you. I heard you'd stepped back from the company. I did, I said. Frank, I want to talk about the note. Pause. Finally, he said with something that sounded like relief. I've had that thing sitting on my books for 9 years. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about a structured settlement, full principal and interest, paid out over 18 months in quarterly installments. I kept it straightforward. And I want to offer you a first right of refusal on a parcel of land in Delwood County, 240 acres, adjacent to the Eastern Bypass Corridor. I'll have an appraisal sent over. Frank was quiet for a moment. The land near the Purcell property? I should have been surprised that he knew it. Frank Deller knew every parcel of commercial adjacent land within 40 miles of his operation because land near transportation corridors was Frank's business intelligence. Adjacent to it, I said. Elias, that land as he stopped. Started again. That's a serious piece of property. I know what it is, I said. I've owned it for 11 years. Why are you moving it? I'm not moving all of it. I'm offering a portion about 60 acres along the northern edge as a first right option, contingent on the note settlement. The remainder I'm keeping. I paused. I'm restructuring some things, Frank. I need liquidity that I can control and deploy quickly. Your note is part of that. What are you deploying it for? Frank Deller was not a man who asked questions without a reason. He knew about Nathan. He knew about the transfer the way everyone in the regional business community did, and he was asking because he was trying to understand what he was being asked to participate in. He deserved a straight answer. There are some situations at the company that need addressing, I said. I'm not asking you to be part of that. The note settlement is a clean transaction, independent of anything else. I'm just telling you honestly what the context is. Another pause. Is Nathan in trouble? The company is in a complicated position, I said carefully. Nathan is working to address it. Are you helping him? I'm having conversations, I said. What I help with and how is still being determined. Frank was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a particular quality, thoughtful, deliberate, the voice of a man who built an 84-person company from 2 trucks and understood exactly what that required. You know, when you wrote me that first loan in '96, the bank had turned me down 3 times. I had a wife, a new baby, and a truck with 200,000 miles on it. And you sat across from me, and you said you'd looked at my numbers and you believed in the operation. He paused. I never forgot that. I don't think I ever told you that properly. Frank, I'm going to accept your settlement terms, he said, and I'll look at the land option. But I want to say that I wanted to say it. Another pause. I hope things work out. For the company and for you and Nathan both. I thanked him. I meant it. After I hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of the shack and thought about what Frank had said about the loan in '96, about believing in the operation. I'd made probably 40 personal loans over the years, and I remembered most of them. And the reason I remembered them was not because of the money. It was because of the people. Because lending someone money when the bank won't touch them is an act of trust that goes both directions, and the relationships it builds are not the same as the relationships that contracts build. They're sturdier. They're the kind that last 26 years and result in a man telling you something real on a phone call because he felt like he'd been carrying it and wanted you to know. Nathan had never understood this part of the business. He'd understood the institutional side, the structures, the leverage, the market positioning. But the part where the money was actually about people, about relationships, about the kind of trust that can't be formalized because it lives in a handshake and a history, that part he'd missed. I don't know if he'd missed it because I'd failed to teach it or because it was simply not the part of the work that interested him. Probably both. Probably, like most things, it was not one cause but several woven together in ways you couldn't fully separate. Gerald came out 3 days later with a document I'd asked him to prepare. Not a legal threat, not a claim, a proposal. A detailed, carefully structured proposal that Gerald had spent 40 hours on, and that represented, in his words, the most complex single document I have produced in 40 years of practice, and I am including the merger agreements. It was a restructuring plan for Whitmore Capital, not a takeover, not a reversal of the transfer. A restructuring, a formal arrangement in which I would provide, through the personal holding structures, a liquidity injection sufficient to address the immediate debt exposure in exchange for a renegotiated governance structure that restored certain oversight mechanisms that Nathan had removed when he restructured the board. Harrison and Park would be restored to full voting board positions. 2 of the new directors Nathan had installed would be moved to advisory roles. And a small, independent oversight committee, 3 people, none of them Nathan's appointees. 2 of them, my designees, would have review authority over any acquisition above a defined threshold for a period of 3 years. Nathan would remain CEO. That was deliberate. Removing him would have been cleaner in some ways, but it would also have sent a message to the market and the investors that the company was in a succession crisis, which would have accelerated exactly the kind of panic the restructuring was meant to prevent. And beyond the practical calculation, he was still my son. I was not willing to publicly humiliate him. I wanted him to survive this and learn from it, not be destroyed by it. There's a difference between accountability and annihilation, and I knew which one I was after. Gerald and I went through the proposal for 2 hours at the folding table. He flagged 3 provisions he wanted to strengthen. I agreed with 2 of them and pushed back on the third, which was a removal clause that I felt was too aggressive a mechanism that would have allowed the Oversight Committee to recommend Nathan's removal under certain conditions. I told Gerald to soften the language. He looked at me over his reading glasses. Elias, that clause protects you. I know it protects me. Soften it anyway. May I ask why? Because a father who puts a removal clause on his son isn't offering a restructuring, I said. He's offering a trap, and I don't want to trap him. I want him to choose this. Gerald looked at me for a long moment. Then he took off his reading glasses and cleaned them on his tie. You are a better man than I would be in your position, he said. You're a better attorney than I deserve, I said. Soften the clause. He softened the clause. I sent the proposal to Nathan on a Thursday morning, emailed from Gerald's office to Nathan's personal email, not his company address, with a cover note I wrote myself. Short. 3 sentences. This is what I'm proposing. Read it with your attorney. Call me when you've thought about it. He called on Saturday. 2 days, which was faster than I'd expected and meant he'd either read it immediately or had someone read it and brief him immediately. Given Nathan, probably both. This is stopped. I heard him exhale. Dad, this is extremely generous. It's a business arrangement, I said. It's structured to save the company and establish conditions that make it harder to get back here. It's not charity. I know it's not charity. I'm saying given everything that's happened, the terms are more than I would have expected. What would you have expected? A pause. Honestly, something designed to put me in a position where I had no real authority. Something punitive. I thought about it, I said. I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't. I decided against it. Why? Because punishing you doesn't help the company. And because I'm 71 years old, and I don't want to spend whatever time I have left in a war with my son. I kept my voice steady. Those are both true at the same time. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had that quality from the night, at the shack, the one that costs something. Diane read it too. I showed it to her last night. I hadn't expected that. Diane had always been careful around me, cordial, in the way of a person keeping precise distance. What did she say? She stopped, cleared his throat. She said I should call you, and accept it before you changed your mind. I almost laughed. Is she right? Yes, Nathan said. She's almost always right. It's exhausting. And there it was, a small, ordinary moment of a son, talking to his father like a person, not a transaction. A husband slightly exasperated by his wife's consistent accuracy. It was so ordinary I barely registered it at first, and then it landed, and I felt it somewhere in the chest, in that place where things land that matter. There are things I want to discuss before you formally accept, I said. Provisions I want to explain in person, not over the phone. When? Come out here Wednesday morning. Bring your attorney if you want. Just me, Nathan said. He came Wednesday at 9. He came in his work coat again, but he'd left the car running in the driveway for a few minutes after he parked, and I recognized that the sitting in the car before something difficult. I'd done it myself more than once in my life. At hospitals, at the office on mornings when I knew the day was going to require more than I had. At my own front door on the night Carol was first diagnosed, when I had to go inside and find a way to tell her what the doctor had said. He knocked. I let him in. The shack was warmer than it had been in November, December, in Delwood County could cut, but the firewood was holding up and the small space heated faster than a larger one. I'd gotten a second folding chair and a small rug that Bea Purcell had sent over with Dell without explanation, and the room looked slightly less austere than it had on Nathan's first visit. He sat. I sat. We went through the proposal, section by section, the way business people do, not warmly, not easily, but honestly, with both of us asking the questions we actually needed answered rather than the ones that sounded better. His attorney had flagged the same two provisions Gerald had originally flagged, which told me their attorneys were reading it at the same level. I answered those questions directly. When we got to the oversight committee, Nathan read that section again and then put the document down on the table. You took out the removal clause, he said. I did. Gerald had one in the original draft. I can tell from the structure of the surrounding language. I looked at my son. Yes. Why'd you take it out? Because it wasn't the kind of arrangement I wanted to make. Nathan looked at the document. His hands were flat on the table on either side of it, the way a man's hands rest when he's trying to stay grounded. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. Do you think I can fix this? The company. He looked up. Honestly, not what you'd say to reassure me. What you actually think. Question hung in the air between us. I gave it the consideration it deserved. The financial situation is recoverable, I said. The liquidity injection addresses the immediate default risk, and the restructured debt timeline gives you room. The acquisitions are what they are, you can't undo them, but you can manage them more conservatively going forward. I kept my eyes on him. The harder question is whether you can rebuild the relationships with the board that eroded when you restructured it. Harrison and Park are professionals, but they're also human beings who spent 4 months being ignored when they were raising legitimate concerns. It takes time to repair. I know, Nathan said. I'm going to talk to them directly. Before anything is formalized. I owe them that, you do. And the institutional investors, he exhaled. I'm going to request individual meetings. Full transparency on the position. No managed version. Good, I said. Do it before the quarterly report goes out, not after. They hear the real picture from you proactively. That's a different conversation than if they read it in a filing. Nathan nodded. He was writing nothing down, but I could tell he was taking it and storing it the way he used to store things in meetings, with a quality of attention that was one of the genuinely impressive things about him when he was operating at his best. What about the Cutter Road property? He asked. The land. What about it? Are you developing it? Selling it? I'm keeping most of it, I said. The 60-acre option to Frank Deller is the only piece I'm moving. The rest is mine. I looked at Nathan. I'm building something on it. He waited. I haven't decided exactly what yet, I said. Something that lasts. Something that means something beyond the quarterly numbers. I paused. I've been thinking about it since August. What you do with land, with resources, when you've decided that the things you built for business reasons are secondary to the things you want to build for other reasons. What other reasons? Legacy reasons, I said. The kind your mother would have understood better than either of us. Nathan was quiet. He looked at the photograph of Carol on the wall, above the cot, The one from the lake house, the summer before. His face did the thing it sometimes did when Carol was mentioned, a very brief tightening that he'd never fully learned to control. She would have hated all of this, he said. She would have been furious with both of us, I agreed. She'd have called me stubborn and called you reckless, and then she'd have made us sit at the kitchen table together until we sorted it out. Something almost like a smile. Not quite. Yeah, she would have. We sat with her for a moment, the way you sit with someone who's gone, not with grief exactly, but with presence, the feeling of a person who is absent from the room, but not from the conversation. Then Nathan said, I need to ask you something I should have asked a long time ago. I waited. When Mom died. Those first couple of years. He was choosing his words carefully, but not in the managed way, in the way of someone who genuinely wants to say something right. I wasn't as present as I should have been. I told myself it was because you seemed okay. Because you kept working, kept moving. I told myself you didn't need. He stopped. That wasn't honest. I think the truth is that her death scared me, and I didn't know how to be around you when I was scared like that. I had not expected this. I want to say that plainly, because I think it matters. I'd built a picture in my mind of what this series of conversations could accomplish, and a genuine accounting from Nathan for how he'd handled the years after Carol's death was not part of that picture. Not because I didn't want it, but because I hadn't let myself want it. Some things you stop wanting, because wanting them and not getting them is worse than not wanting them at all. I know, I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. Cleared my throat. I know it scared you. It scared me too. Scared me every single day for 2 years. I looked at my hands on the table. I leaned on you more than I should have. That's on me. When you're grieving and you're scared yourself, it's easy to make someone else carry more than they can. I should have been able to carry more, Nathan said. I was 34. I should have been able, Nathan. I stopped him. You were also grieving. You lost your mother. Whatever else happened between us, you lost your mother and you were scared and you handled it imperfectly. That's allowed. That's human. I met his eyes. I wasn't handling it perfectly either. I pushed you toward the company because it gave me something to stand on. And then when the company started feeling like something I was losing, I think part of what I felt, under all the rest of it, was that I was losing you too. And I didn't say that. I just hardened around it. The room was very quiet. Outside, the December fields were still and flat and gray-white with the morning frost. I'm sorry, Nathan said, for the advisory board, for the surveyors, for the real estate agent and the legal filing. And he stopped. For sending you out here. That's the one I can't. His voice broke on that last word, just slightly, just at the edge, and he controlled it, but not all the way. You built everything, and I sent you to live in a shack because I thought you couldn't stop me. I could have stopped you, I said quietly. I had the means to stop you before you ever got started. You know that now. Why didn't you? I had thought about this question more than almost any other in the months I'd spent in this shack. I'd turned it over in the early mornings, when the cold woke me up, and in the long evenings, with the lamb at the files, and I'd come to an answer that I wasn't entirely proud of, but that I believed was true. Because I needed to know, I said, how far you would go. Not as a test, not as some deliberate plan to teach you a lesson. That makes it sound cleaner than it was. I looked at the table, at the organized files, at the document between us. I think, on some level, I had been hoping I was wrong about what I was seeing, about who you were becoming, and the only way to find out if I was wrong was to let it happen. Let it run until it ran out. I paused. It ran further than I wanted. I won't pretend otherwise. Nathan absorbed that, and now? He asked. Who do you think I am now? I think you're someone who drove out to a shack in November and told his father the truth when it would have been easier to lie, I said. I think that's who you are now. The question is whether it's who you stay. He was quiet for a moment. The proposal, he said. I want to accept it. Formally with the attorneys. Whatever Gerald needs from our side. He put his hand on the document. But I want to say outside the formal structure that I understand what you gave me. Not the money, not the restructuring plan. He met my eyes. The fact that you didn't put the removal clause in. It's a business arrangement, I said again, more gently this time. It's more than that, Nathan said. We both know it's more than that. I didn't argue with him. We spent another hour on the specifics. Terms, timelines, the sequencing of the board conversations, and the investor meetings. Nathan had questions that were smart and precise, the part of him that was genuinely good at the work showing through the layer of difficulty that had accumulated over the past 2 years. When he was operating at the level his intelligence allowed, he was genuinely impressive. That had always been true. What he hadn't had, what he was going to have to build, the hard way, through consequences, was judgment. Not intelligence, judgment. The two things are not the same, and you can have all of one and be badly short of the other. He left at noon. At the door he paused, the way he'd paused the first time. But it was different this time. Last time the pause had been about taking something in the smallness of the shack, the reality of his father's situation, the weight of what he'd done. This time it was different. He turned around and looked at me with something clear and direct in his face. "Lily wants to come out here," he said. "She asked about you constantly." Diane kept making excuses. He stopped. I kept making excuses. "She wants to see you, Lily. 11 years old now. The girl who used to fall asleep on the couch after Sunday dinner and get carried to the car. The girl in the photograph on the south wall, 4 years old, and on my shoulders in the backyard at Caldwell Road, laughing at something I'd said. Tell her to come Sunday," I said. "Tell her I'll make lunch." Nathan almost smiled. "On a 2-burner stove." "It's sufficient," I said. He left. I listened to the car pull out and go down the road toward Delwood, and when the sound of it had gone, I sat back down at the folding table and put my hands flat on either side of the proposal, and I breathed for a while in the quiet of the December afternoon. The agreement was not the end of anything. I want to be clear about that, because I think when people tell stories like this one, there's a temptation to treat the moment of formal resolution as the moment of actual resolution, and those two things are almost never the same. The document between us on the table was necessary. It was the right structure for the right moment, but it was paper. Paper is not relationship. Paper is not trust. Paper is not two people choosing to be honest with each other on a cold night in a shack in Delwood County, choosing it over and over again instead of retreating to the easier thing. What came next was going to be harder in some ways than everything that had come before. Not because of the company was a problem I understood, with mechanisms I knew and variables I could work with. But the thing between Nathan and me, the thing that had broken somewhere in the years after Carol died, in the slow, patient accumulation of small choices on both our parts, that was not a problem with a document solution. That was the long work. The kind that doesn't have a quarterly report and doesn't show up in any filing and can't be measured by any external metric. I was 71 years old. I'd learned, somewhere in the middle of those 71 years, that the long work was the only work worth doing. 3 days after Nathan's Wednesday visit, something happened that I had not anticipated, and that came from a direction I hadn't been watching. Diane called. Not texted. Called. On a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, when I was eating soup from a can at the folding table with a book propped against the lamp and the fire low in the lean-to. Her name on my phone screen stopped me mid-spoonful. I answered. Diane Elias. Her voice was different from what I remembered. Diane had always spoken to me with the particular warmth of a person maintaining careful distance, cordial, appropriate, never quite warm enough to be real. This was different. This was just her voice, without the management of it. I wanted to call you myself. Nathan doesn't know I'm calling. All right, I said. I owe you an apology, she said. Not for Nathan's choices, those are his to answer for. But for my part in it. A pause. I didn't push him to handle things differently. There were moments where I could see where it was going, and I told myself it wasn't my place to get in the middle of it, and it was a way of not having to say anything uncomfortable. She stopped. I knew about the surveyors before they went to the property. He told me. And I didn't say anything to him, and I definitely didn't say anything to you. That was wrong. I was quiet for a moment. I had not expected this either, and I was learning in these weeks that the things I didn't expect were often the most important ones. I appreciate that, I said. And then, because it was true, it matters. More than you probably realize. She paused again. He's trying. He's been different this week. Since he came back from seeing you on Wednesday. I don't know exactly how to describe it. Like something that was wound too tight, finally has some room in it. Another pause. Lily cried when he told her she could see you on Sunday. She really cried. She's been asking about you for months, and her voice caught, very briefly. We kept telling her you were busy. The image of Lily crying was something I had to set aside for this moment because it went somewhere in my chest that I wasn't equipped to handle in the middle of a phone call. Sunday, I said. Tell her Sunday. We'll be there, Diane said. And then, thank you, Elias, for what you're doing for the company, and for not closing the door on Nathan. It would have been understandable if you had. He's my son, said. Simply. Just that. After the call, I sat for a long time. The soup had gone cold. The lamp was doing its job. Outside, the December dark was complete, the kind of dark that only exists in places far enough from cities that the sky is actually black instead of orange-gray. I looked at the photograph of Carol on the wall, the lake house, the summer before, and I thought about what she would have made of all of this, the whole long, complicated mess of it. I decided she would have said, finally. She had a directness I'd always admired and often failed to match. I was getting better at it. In my 71st year, living in a shack in Delwood County with a folding table and 2 chairs and a lamp on an extension cord. Better late than not at all. That had always been my working principle on most things, and it had not failed me yet. Sunday came in bright and cold. I'd driven into Delwood Saturday and bought actual food, not ambitious food, nothing I would embarrass myself with on a 2-burner stove, but real food, a pot of chili I'd made Carol's way, from a recipe I'd memorized from watching her make it enough times that I hadn't needed to write it down. Cornbread from a box mix, which she would have judged, but the oven situation was what it was. Coffee, good coffee, not the instant, because some things were worth the small additional effort. I'd also bought a small folding table to put against the wall as a secondary surface, because 4 people at one folding table in 400 square feet required some spatial creativity. They arrived at 11:45. Nathan's car on the gravel, the doors opening, and then Lily, actually running across the dry winter grass toward the shack door, which I'd opened before she reached it because I'd been watching from the window. She hit me like something launched from a distance, both arms around my middle, face pressed into my coat, not saying anything for a moment, just holding on. She was 11 tall for her age, Carol's dark hair and Nathan's jaw, and her own particular way of being in the world that belonged to nobody but her. I put my arms around her and held on back, and I didn't say anything either for a moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said. "Grandpa," she said finally, muffled against my coat, "your house is really small." I laughed. An actual laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere lower than the throat. "I know, sweetheart. Come inside." Nathan and Diane came through the door behind her. Diane hugged me, actually hugged me, not the careful distance-maintaining embrace of the previous years, but an actual hug, and said something quiet near my ear that I'll keep to myself. Nathan shook my hand, and then, after a moment, didn't let go of it, and I didn't let go of his, and we stood there in the doorway of the shack, in that slightly awkward way of men who are not accustomed to the full weight of what they're feeling. Then Lily said from inside the shack, "Is that chili?" "That smells exactly like Grandma's chili." And we both let go. The afternoon was not perfect. It was not a movie version reconciliation where every wound healed and every hard thing was resolved over a good meal. Nathan and I were careful with each other in some ways. The scar tissue was still fresh, and there were things that hadn't been said yet that would need to be said eventually. Conversations we hadn't had the groundwork for quite yet. Diane was warmer than I'd seen her, but also clearly feeling the weight of what she'd acknowledged on the phone, that particular discomfort of genuine accountability that doesn't fully lift in a single afternoon. These were imperfect people in an imperfect situation trying to do better, which is honestly most of what any of us are at any given moment. But Lily ate 2 bowls of chili and declared the cornbread acceptable, which, from an 11-year-old with opinions, was a compliment. She looked at the photographs on the south wall for a long time and then said, "About the lake house picture. She looks really happy there." And I said she was. That was a good summer. And Lily nodded, satisfied with that, the way children sometimes are with simple true things. After lunch, she asked if she could walk outside, and Nathan went with her, and Diane and I sat at the folding table with coffee and the quiet of a room that had been through a great deal and was still standing. And Diane asked me what I was planning to do with the land. "Something that lasts," I said. The same thing I'd told Nathan. "Like what?" I looked out the east window at the 240 acres going flat and gray-white, and still in the December light, and Lily and Nathan moving across it, the girl reaching up to point at something, and her father looking at whatever she was pointing to. Two figures in a landscape that was mine. That had always been mine, even when I'd had nothing else. I'm thinking about a foundation, I said. Something that uses the land and the capital to do work in the community. Small business support, the kind I used to do personally. Employment programs. Maybe something agricultural. There are young farmers who need what I needed in the early years and can't get it from a bank. I paused. Carol always wanted to do something like that. We talked about it and we never got to it, and I think I stopped. I think I'm getting to it now. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she would have loved that. Yes, I said. She would have. We sat with that, and the coffee, and the December light, and Nathan and Lily outside moving across the land, and the whole complicated weight of the last 2 years sitting in the room with us, like something that had been very heavy and was slowly, carefully, not becoming light exactly, but becoming something you could carry without it crushing you. That was enough. For that afternoon, that was exactly enough. January came hard that year. The kind of January that Delwood County does when it decides to remind you it's capable of serious weather, not the dramatic kind with blizzards and downed lines, but the grinding kind, persistent cold, that settles into everything and doesn't lift for weeks at a time, that gets into old buildings and old joints, and makes every morning a small negotiation between your body and the day. I woke up at 5:30 as always, made coffee on the 2-burner stove as always, and sat at the folding table in the gray pre-dawn light and did what I'd been doing every morning since August. I thought about where things stood. Where things stood in January was complicated in the way that real progress is always complicated, which is to say, it didn't look like progress from the inside. It looked like a series of difficult conversations and uncertain outcomes and slow movements that you couldn't fully evaluate until more time had passed. The restructuring agreement had been formally executed in the 3rd week of December. Gerald and Nathan's attorneys had spent 8 days going back and forth on language before both sides signed. Nathan had not tried to negotiate away any of the core oversight provisions, which Gerald told me privately was either a sign of genuine good faith or the most sophisticated long play I've ever seen, and after 40 years I'm still not sure I can reliably tell the difference. I told Gerald it was genuine good faith, and he looked at me over his reading glasses in a way that suggested he hoped I was right and was reserving judgment. The liquidity injection structured as a formal loan from my personal holding trust to the company, with terms that were fair but not charitable. Because I'd meant it when I said it wasn't. Charity went in the 2nd week of January. Harrison had confirmed to me privately, in a brief phone call, that he clearly felt awkward making, that the numbers had stabilized enough to get through the quarter without triggering the default clauses. He said it carefully. The way a professional says something he's relieved about, but doesn't want to overstate. Gives us room to work, he said. That's what we needed. I thanked him and told him I was glad he'd called me in the fall. He was quiet for a moment and then said, I wasn't sure you'd want to hear it. I told him that was exactly why I'd wanted to hear it. Nathan had done the board meeting in the 1st week of January. The full picture, the real numbers, the actual exposure, the remediation timeline. I hadn't been in the room for it. I hadn't asked to be. This was his work to do and his board to face, and the only thing I'd said when he told me he was ready was, tell them everything. Not almost everything. Everything. He'd said he understood. He called me the evening after the meeting. It was a Tuesday, cold and clear, and I was sitting by the lean-to-fire with the door cracked, because the heat was good and I wanted the air. It was bad, he said. 2 of the directors want a formal performance review at the end of Q1. Jameson, the one I brought in from the Meridian deal, resigned on the spot. Said he wasn't going to sit on a board that had been misled about the company's position. A pause. He wasn't wrong to resign. I had misled him. Not deliberately at first, but I'd let the managed version stand longer than was honest. How did Harrison handle it? Harrison was Nathan stopped. Harrison was gracious. More than I deserved. He said the board had a responsibility to evaluate the current situation rather than relitigate the past, and that the restructuring plan was sound, and that he was prepared to support it. Another pause, shorter. He looked at me while he said it in a way that I don't think I'll forget. Kind of way. The kind that says, I see you clearly and I'm choosing to extend you something anyway. Like not forgiveness exactly. Something more transactional than forgiveness. More like a probation. Nathan exhaled. Which is appropriate. Which is what I earned. It is, I said, and it's also enough to work with. You don't need their love. You need their participation and their scrutiny. Those are more useful. Nathan was quiet for a moment. You know what's strange, he said. Hearing you talk about it like that, just straight, it's the practical reality that's more comforting than if you'd said something reassuring. Reassuring things are comfortable in the moment and useless after, I said. You know that. I know it now, he said. We talked for another 20 minutes about the investor meetings he had scheduled for the following week, about the debt restructuring timeline, about the operational changes Harrison and Park were going to push for in the lending portfolio. Practical things, business things. But underneath them, woven through the conversation in the way that important things often travel through the ordinary, through the everyday, was something else. The texture of two people who had stopped pretending with each other. It wasn't warm every moment. It wasn't easy. There were pauses where I could feel both of us choosing our words carefully, because the carefulness was still necessary. But it was real, and real, even when it's hard, is better than smooth. I'd learned that lesson early and kept relearning it, the way you relearn things that are worth knowing. The investor meetings came and went through the second and third weeks of January. Nathan called after each one not to report success, because success was too simple a word for what those meetings were. He called to tell me what had happened, which was different. Some of the investors had responded with conditional support, the kind that comes with monitoring requirements and reporting schedules and very clear statements about what the next quarterly numbers needed to show. One had exercised a review clause and was formally assessing its position. Two had responded better than Nathan expected, which he said with the kind of genuine surprise that told me he genuinely braced for worse. None of it was clean. None of it was resolved. What it was honest, and honesty, after a long period of managed presentation, has a particular quality of relief, even when the honest picture is difficult. People can work with a difficult truth. They cannot work with a comfortable fiction, because the friction between the fiction and reality shows up eventually in ways that are always worse than the honest picture would have been. I told Nathan this after the third investor meeting, when he sounded wrung out in the way of a man who has been delivering hard news repeatedly and is feeling the cumulative weight of it. He said, I keep thinking about how different it would have been if the first quarterly report after I took over had reflected the actual position of those acquisitions. He said it not quite as a question. It would have been an easier year, I said. I was afraid of looking like I'd made a mistake in the first 6 months, he said. So I structured the reporting to minimize the visibility of the exposure, which I told myself was prudent and was actually just avoidance. Yes, I said. And now it's a much bigger problem than it would have been. Yes, I said again. That's how it works, Nathan. The thing you avoid doesn't disappear. It grows into the dark. A silence. Is that something you learned from experience? More than once, I said. More times than I'd like to count. Name one, Nathan said. And there was something in the way he said it, direct, curious, not aggressive, that reminded me of the boy who used to ask questions across my desk with those serious dark eyes. The boy who wanted to understand how things worked. So I told him about a decision I'd made in the mid-90s, a real estate acquisition that I'd known at the time was overpriced, but that I'd proceeded with, because I was afraid of looking risk-averse to a set of institutional investors who'd been pushing for expansion. The acquisition had underperformed for 4 years and required a restructuring that cost the company more than I'd saved by making the deal in the first place. I'd never told anyone the full story of why I'd actually made that decision, the fear underneath it, the pride that dressed itself as strategic reasoning. I told it to Nathan on the phone in January, sitting by the lean-to-fire, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You never told me about that one, he said. No. Why not? I thought about it. Same reason you didn't tell Harrison what the numbers actually were, I said. I didn't want to be the person who'd made that mistake. I wanted to be the person who'd built the company correctly. I paused. We teach the things we're proud of. We tend to keep quiet about the rest. And then our children inherit our pride without our failures to balance it. And they think they're starting from a level above where they actually are. The silence that followed was long enough that I thought maybe it had been too much, too direct, too late, too much to absorb in a phone call. But then Nathan said quietly, I needed to hear that. I think I needed to hear that a long time ago. I should have said it a long time ago, I said. That's on me. February brought a thaw in the second week, and then a hard freeze again in the third, the kind that splits wood and tests old pipes. Del Purcell came by on the last Thursday of February with his son Marcus, and they spent half a day reinforcing the insulation on the shack's north wall and checking the pipe joints. And when they were done, B came out with lunch, and the four of us ate in the lean-to because the shack was too small for it. Marcus ate more than all three of us combined and said almost nothing, which I'd come to understand was simply how Marcus was. And Del and I talked about the land and the spring and what Del thought the 60-acre option to Frank Deller would mean for the character of that corner of the property. Development changes things, Del said. He wasn't complaining. It was an observation, the kind that carries a whole philosophy inside it, if you listen for it. Everything changes things, I said. Sure. He looked out over the land, the flat white fields in the February light. Question is what kind of change? Whether the thing that was there before gets to persist in some form, or whether it just gets replaced. I looked at the land. My land. 240 acres that I'd bought quietly, 11 years ago, because I'd looked at the county development maps and seen what the bypass corridor was going to do to the eastern edge of Delwood, and understood that the value was there before most other people could see it. But also, and I want to be honest about this, because it's the part that matters most, I'd bought it because I liked the land. Because I'd stood on it the first time and felt something settle in me, the way it settles in certain people when they're on ground that suits them. Carol had come out with me that first time. 11 years ago, and she'd stood in the field with her coat against the wind and looked at the shack and said, "What are you going to do with that old thing?" And I'd said I didn't know yet. And she'd said, "You'll figure it out. You always do eventually." The thing that was there before, I said to Del, is going to persist. That's part of what I'm working on. The foundation had been taking shape since November, mostly in my head, and in notes I'd made on legal pads at the folding table. But increasingly in conversations with Gerald and with a woman named Patricia Huang, who ran a nonprofit development consulting firm out of Columbus, and who came highly recommended by two people whose judgment I trusted. Patricia had driven out to the shack in January, taken one look at the folding table and the documents, and said, "You've been doing your homework." I told her I'd had time. She'd smiled at that, the smile of someone who understands what it means to choose clarity over comfort. The Whitmore Land Foundation, as it had tentatively been named, would operate from the Cutter Road property. Not all of it, the 60 acres going to Frank Deller's option, were at the north end, well away from the shack and the land around it. The remaining 180 acres, along with a capital endowment structured through personal holding trust, would support three initial programs. A small business loan program modeled on the kind of personal lending I'd done for decades but formalized, with a professional review process and mentorship components, an agricultural development program for young farmers in Delwood County who needed capital and guidance that the conventional lenders wouldn't provide, and a workforce program in partnership with the county's technical college focused on the trades and the skilled labor that the county needed and couldn't find enough of. Carol had talked about something like this for 20 years. We'd always said we'd get to it. Life had been busy. The company had demanded everything. And then she'd gotten sick, and we hadn't gotten to it. And I'd carried that as a quiet grief in the years since, not the most acute grief, not the sharpest one, but one of the ones that sits at the edge of your awareness and reminds you, periodically, of the gap between what you meant to do and what you actually did. I was getting to it now. It was late. It was late in a way that couldn't be undone. But it was not too late to do it, and the difference between late and too late is the only difference that matters. Patricia had been characteristically direct in January. The endowment size you're talking about, combined with the land, can sustain meaningful programs for decades if the governance structure is right. But the governance has to be independent. You can't run it yourself. You can be the founding voice, the vision, the person whose name is on the door if you want that. But the operational decisions need to be made by people who aren't you, because foundations that depend on a single person's judgment don't outlast that person. I know, I said. Do you actually know it? Or are you telling me what I want to hear? I had liked her immediately for that. I actually know it, I said. I've spent 40 years building something that depended too much on my specific way of doing things. I'm not interested in doing it again. She'd nodded, satisfied. Then we have something to work with. The formal board of the Whitmore Land Foundation was constituted in March. Patricia was chair. The other four members were Arthur Greer, who at 81 was sharp as he'd ever been, and who said when I asked him that he'd been waiting for someone to find a use for him that wasn't litigation. A young woman named Sasha Okafor, who ran the county's technical college and who had more practical intelligence about workforce development than anyone else I'd encountered. Del Purcell, who knew the land and the agricultural community of Delwood County in his bones, and whose participants were in a conversation over coffee in the lean-to that had taken less than 5 minutes to conclude. And Gerald Fitch, because no entity I was involved in would ever lack for proper legal oversight if I had anything to say about it. The first full board meeting was held in the shack on Cutter Road. I want to be clear that this was not a symbolic choice, or rather, it was a symbolic choice. But it was also a practical one, because the shack was the only suitable space on the property, and the foundation's permanent facility was still in planning. We sat around the folding table, which was not large enough for 6 people, and Patricia had brought an additional table from her car that we pushed against it, and we sat in a combination of my 2 folding chairs. Chairs Dell had brought from his truck, and a wooden chair Arthur Greer had brought because he'd said he preferred a chair with a proper back at his age. It was not a polished gathering. It was 6 people in a 400-square-foot shack in March, with the heat running, and the coffee strong, and the documents spread across 2 pushed-together tables, doing serious work on something that was going to outlast all of us. That was exactly the right kind of gathering for what it was. At the end of the meeting, when the initial governance documents had been reviewed, and the first programming priorities had been roughed out, Arthur Greer looked around the room and said, in his dry, precise way, Elias, you built a company for 40 years and your son took it, and then you came out here and built something better. He wasn't being sentimental. Arthur was constitutionally incapable of sentiment. He was making an observation with the same precision he'd brought to contract law for 60 years. Think Carol would agree. I didn't trust my voice for a moment. I didn't try to use it. She would have run this better than all of us, I said when I could. Arthur nodded. Probably, he said. And that was Nathan came to the property in April for the first time since the December Sunday lunch. Not for a business meeting, there was no agenda. He called on a Wednesday and said Lily had a school program on Saturday, but she wanted to come out Sunday if that was still something I was open to, and he wanted to come too, just to walk the land if I'd let him. I said yes. I said it before he finished the sentence. They came Sunday, just him and Lily this time. Diane was in Columbus visiting her sister. Lily was in the kind of mood that 11-year-olds are in when spring has finally arrived, and they've been cooped up through a long winter, which is to say she was everywhere at once and full of opinions about everything. She walked the perimeter of the shack and announced that it needed window boxes, which was not wrong. She walked out into the field with her arms out and her face up to the April sun and spun in a circle the way small children do, except she was not so small anymore. I watched her from the porch of the shack, the porch that Dell and Marcus had reinforced in February, one of the things they'd done that I hadn't asked for and couldn't imagine not having now, and felt something that I don't have a clean word for. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was in it. Something deeper and less tidy. Something that had weight. Nathan stood beside me on the porch. He watched Lily in the field. He was quiet for a while, in the way he'd started being quiet. Not managing the silence, just being in it. How are the numbers looking? I asked, because I wanted to know and because it was easier to start there. Better, he said. The Q1 report will show the real position, and it won't be good, but the remediation trajectory is visible. Harrison thinks the 2 investors who were most concerned will hold once they see the Q1 numbers alongside the restructuring documentation. He paused. Jameson, the one who resigned, sent me a letter last week. Said he'd been following the situation and that he thought what I was doing was the right approach belatedly. Stopped short of any offer to return, but he sent the letter. That took something, I said. Yeah. Nathan looked at the field. Lily had stopped spinning and was now investigating something near the fence line with the serious attention of a person who has found something interesting. I called him after I got the letter, thanked him for sending it, and told him his resignation was warranted and that I didn't hold it against him. How did that go? Awkward, Nathan said. But real. He searched for the word. He seemed like he needed to hear it. Like he'd been carrying something about the whole situation, and the letter was him trying to put some of it down, and the call let him put the rest of it down. I thought about what Nathan was describing, the way accountability, when it's genuine, doesn't just change the person exercising it, it changes the people around them. It gives people room to put things down that they've been carrying. It doesn't fix everything. It doesn't erase what happened, but it changes the air in the room. "How's Diane?" I asked. Nathan smiled slightly. "She's good." She paused in a way that told me he was deciding how honest to be. "Then, she's been better since December than she's been in a couple of years. I think she was carrying the weight of what was happening between us, between me and you, and not being able to say anything about it. She doesn't carry things lightly. She internalizes. She called me in December," I said, "the week after you came here, to apologize." Nathan turned to look at me. "She didn't tell me that." "I know. She told me she hadn't." I looked at him. "She's a good woman, Nathan. She was caught in something she didn't know how to navigate, and she made the wrong call by staying quiet, and then she called me and owned it. That took character." Nathan looked back at the field. A long moment. "I know she is," he said quietly. "I haven't always," he stopped. "I've taken some things for granted that I'm working on not taking for granted." "Good," I said. Just that. Lily had come back from the fence line and was now standing in front of the shack, looking at it with her head tilted to one side. "Grandpa," she called, "this porch is new. The wood's different." "Dell fixed it in February," I said. "Who's Dell?" "The man who owns the property next door. His son Marcus did most of the work." Lily looked at the porch planks with the focused assessment of a person who takes craftsmanship seriously, which she appeared to. "Good work," she said. Then she came up the steps and stood between Nathan and me and looked out at the field she'd just been spinning in, the same view we'd been looking at. "This land is really big," she said. 240 acres, I said. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm building something on it," I said. "A foundation. Something that helps people who need what your great-grandfather needed when he was starting out." I looked at her. "He came to Delwood County with nothing, you know. Nothing. He worked agricultural labor for 3 years before he had enough saved to rent a storefront." Lily looked at me. "I didn't know that." "No," I said. "I should have told you before." I looked at Nathan. "I should have told you both more of it than I did." Nathan held my gaze for a moment. Something in his face, not the conference room face, not the managed face, the real one. "Tell us now," he said, so I did. We stood on the porch of the shack in the April sun, and I told them about my father, a man named William Whitmore, who had come to Delwood County in 1951. With a third-grade education and hands that knew hard work and nothing else, and who had worked other people's land for years before he'd saved enough to try something of his own. I told them about watching my father walk into the county's one bank in his best clothes in 1962 to ask for a small business loan, and walking out 45 minutes later with the particular posture of a man who has been told no in, a way that was designed to remind him of his place. I told them about the man who'd eventually lent my father the money, not a bank, a person, an old established farmer named Hatch, who'd watched my father work for 3 years and trusted what he saw, and about what that loan had meant. Not just the money, the act, the statement embedded in the act, "I believe in what you're capable of." That was where Whitmore Capital had actually come from. Not from me. From my father, who built a small supply business from Hatch's loan and ran it honestly for 20 years, and from Hatch, who'd trusted a man the bank had told no, and from every person along that chain who'd extended something when they didn't have to. Lily was listening with the focused attention she'd given the porch planks. Nathan was listening in a way I hadn't seen from him in years open present, not thinking about the next thing or the strategic implication or the conference room angle, just listening. "The foundation," I said, "is named after your grandmother. Formally, it's the Whitmore Land Foundation, but the lending program inside it is going to be called the Carol Whitmore Small Business Fund." I looked at them both. I decided that in February, and I should have told you sooner. Nathan's expression moved through something I won't try to fully describe. "She would have argued about having her name on it," he said. "She would have argued for about 10 minutes, and then she would have been secretly pleased," I said. Nathan almost laughed. It was the closest thing to the real laugh, the one from before the hard years that I'd heard from him. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's exactly right." The construction on the foundation's permanent facility began in May. Not the shack was staying. and I was staying in it, at least for now, because I'd made a decision that surprised me when I first made it and felt increasingly right the longer I sat with it. I wasn't going back to Caldwell Road. Margaret Holloway's lease was running, and I told Gerald to draw up an offer, a real offer, fair market value, sold to her if she wanted it. She called me when the offer came through and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Are you sure?" I said I was sure. She said, "I love this house." I said I knew. I said that was why I wanted her to have it. The shack on Cutter Road was mine. In a way, the house on Caldwell Road had stopped being, not because of anything Nathan had done, but because of what I'd found here. What you find in a place when you've stripped everything else away, and it's just you and the land and the work. I'd come here with nothing but what was on that folding table, and I'd built not the foundation, not the formal structure of it, but something interior and harder to name. Clarity about what mattered. A knowledge of who I was without the Whitmore building and the advisory title and the house with the curtains Carol had picked out. I was 71 years old, and I had learned something I should have known at 35. Better late than too late. That remained my working principle. The facility, a low, practical building designed by a local architect named Rosa Kimura, who understood what the land needed and didn't try to impose on it, was framed by September. It sat at the edge of the property's central clearing, 300 yards from the shack, connected by a gravel path that Dell had helped me lay in June. The shack itself had been winterized properly, insulated and rewired, and given a wood stove that actually drew correctly, transforming it from a place a man endured into a place a man could choose. I chose it. The first small business loan from the Carol Whitmore Fund went out in October to a 29-year-old woman named Teresa Briggs, who wanted to open a mobile repair shop for agricultural equipment, who had the skills and the plan and the work history, and absolutely nothing that the regional bank was interested in as collateral. Patricia Huang and her review committee had gone through 11 applications in the first round. Teresa's was the strongest. When Patricia called to tell her, Teresa apparently said nothing for a full 10 seconds and then said, "I'm sorry, can you say that again?" Which Patricia reported to me with something close to delight. I drove to meet Teresa Briggs in October. I wanted to look at the person on the other end of the first loan the way old Hatch must have looked at my father, to see what was there. Teresa was small and practical, with grease still under her fingernails from the morning's work, and she looked me in the eye and shook my hand and said, "Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know I don't take this lightly." I told her I could see that. I told her the loan wasn't charity, and it wasn't a favor. It was a bet on what I could see she was capable of, and I expected her to prove me right. She said she intended to. I believed her. Driving back to Cutter Road from that meeting, I thought about Hatch, and about my father, and about the chain of things that connect a man in 1,962 being told no by a bank to a woman in her 20s being told yes by a foundation 50 years later. These chains are invisible most of the time. You can't see them unless you look at the whole length of them. But they're there, and they carry something forward, and what they carry is not money. Money is just the medium. What they carry is the belief that a person's potential is worth betting on. That is the thing that can be passed down, that outlasts any individual life, that constitutes, if anything, does a real legacy. Nathan came to the Foundation's October open house. He came with Diane and Lily, and he stood in the new facility's main room and looked at the framed photograph we'd put on the wall, Carol, at the lake house, the summer before, the same photograph I had above the cot in the shack, and he stood there looking at it for a long time, without saying anything. Lily stood beside him and slipped her hand into his, the way she'd done when she was small. I watched them from across the room and did not intrude on the moment, because some moments don't need anyone else in them. They need to be what they are. Later, when the room had thinned out, and Patricia was talking with Arthur in the corner, and Dell and Bea were at the food table, because Bea had brought food, as she reliably did, Nathan found me near the back door, and we stepped outside for a moment in the October evening air. The fields were going gold and rust in the late light. The shack was visible down the gravel path, lit from inside, looking in the particular generous light of October at 5 in the afternoon, almost like something you'd want to live in. Which I did want to live in and did. "I want to tell you something," Nathan said. He was looking at the shack. "All right. I've been thinking about what you said months ago in the shack, about why you kept everything separate. About Gerald telling you to, and about the part of you that understood risk and listened. He turned to look at me. I've been thinking about the part of the story I told myself. The one where I was the person moving things forward and you were the person holding things back. The story I needed to believe in order to do what I did. And I knew it wasn't fully true while I was telling it, he said. That's the part I've been sitting with. I didn't deceive myself completely. I knew somewhere that the story had gaps, and I told it anyway because the gaps were inconvenient. He met my eyes directly. I wanted to say that explicitly, not as part of an apology because I've apologized, but because I think you deserve to know that I knew, that it wasn't ignorance. This was the hardest thing he'd said to me in all of our conversations. Harder than the admission at the shack in November, harder than the acknowledgement at the board meeting, harder than any of the practical accounting of what he'd done. Because this was the thing that lives underneath all the others, the knowledge that a person had, and the choice they made despite the knowledge. That is the heart of every betrayal. Not the thing done in the dark, but the thing done with some light, and chosen anyway. I looked at my son for a long moment. The October light was doing something particular to the fields, that end-of-day gold that makes even ordinary things look like they're worth preserving. I know you knew, I said. I've known that since the first conversation at the shack. He held my gaze. And you're my son, I said. For the third time in this story, I said it. Just that. Not because it excused anything. Not because it erased what he'd done or what it had cost. But because it was the most fundamental true thing, and true things, said plainly, are the ones that actually carry weight. Nathan looked away. His jaw worked briefly. When he looked back, his eyes were wet, not crying. He wasn't going to cry. That wasn't his way, but wet at the edges. The way eyes get when something has pushed through that doesn't usually get through. I'm going to spend a long time trying to earn that back, he said. I know, I said. I'll be watching. It was not a warm thing to say. It was not a gentle thing to say. It was an honest thing to say. And at this point in my life, honesty was the thing I had to offer. The thing I was most capable of. The thing I'd learned finally. Imperfectly. Late was more valuable than comfort. We went back inside. Lily had found Patricia's tablet and was apparently helping redesign the foundation's logo, which Patricia was accepting with a grace that suggested she'd raised children and knew how to let them participate in something, without fully ceding control of it. Arthur Greer was eating one of Bia's sandwiches and talking to Dell about drainage on the north field with the focused attention of a man who is interested in everything and bored by nothing. Gerald was in the corner, looking at his phone, because Gerald was always looking at something, and when he looked up and caught my eye, he gave me a small nod, the kind that means, "This is what you said it was going to be." I nodded back. This is the part of the story where I'm supposed to tell you that everything was resolved, that Nathan became the man I'd always hoped he'd be, and the company recovered, and the foundation flourished, and I found some version of peace that made the difficult years feel worthwhile. And the honest answer is, some of those things are true, and some are still becoming true, and some may always remain partial. The company stabilized through the year and into the next. Nathan made decisions that were more careful and more honest, and the board held him to them. Harrison remained. 2 of the new directors rotated out by the following spring, not in crisis, but in the ordinary course of reassessment that a healthy board does. The company was not the company it had been when I ran it, and it was not going to be, and that was appropriate. It was Nathan's company now, genuinely, and it needed to reflect what he was capable of, which was considerable when it wasn't being warped by the particular combination of ambition and entitlement that had driven the worst of it. The foundation grew, carefully, because Patricia was careful, and I insisted on careful. The second loan cycle in spring had 19 applicants and funded 4 of them. Teresa Briggs was 3 months ahead of her repayment schedule by April and had hired her first employee, a 22-year-old kid named Devin, who she'd apparently spotted at the technical college and decided was worth taking a chance on, which made me feel something I didn't have a word for and still don't. Lily came to the foundation spring program day with her school class. I stood at the back of the room and watched her explain the agricultural program to 2 of her classmates, with the particular authority of a 12-year-old who has decided she knows something. She did know something. She'd been listening more carefully than any of us had realized. I am 71 years old, or I was when this story began. and I am 72 now, and I live in a shack on 240 acres in Delwood County, Ohio. I have a folding table and a wood stove and Dell's firewood and Bia's cooking when she decides I need it, and the photographs on the south wall and the gravel path to the foundation facility and the October light on the fields and all. Of this is in the accounting that matters. Enough. More than enough. It is the kind of enough that you don't understand until you've lived for a while with less than you thought you needed, and discovered that the less was clarifying. I want to say something to you directly. Not as a character in a story, but as a person who lived through a thing and came out on the other side of it with something worth saying. If someone in your life has decided you are finished, has looked at your age or your circumstances, or the things you've given up or given away, and concluded that you no longer have power, no longer have options, no longer have the capacity to define what happens next, they are wrong. Not might be wrong, are wrong. Power is not what's visible. Resources are not what's listed in a transfer document. What a person actually has is almost never what other people can see, because the most important things, judgment, patience, knowledge, relationships, the ability to wait for the right moment, these are interior things. These don't show up in any accounting. And if you are the person who has convinced yourself that taking something from someone who trusted you was justified because they were slowing down, because you were ready, because the opportunity was there, and you told yourself a story that made it feel reasonable, I want you to hear what it cost. Not what it cost me, what it cost Nathan. Because it was not a clean acquisition. There is no such thing as a clean acquisition of something that wasn't yours to take. There is only the long accounting, the slow revelation of what the act actually was, beneath the story you told about it, and the work of living in that knowledge and deciding what to do with it. The shack is real. The shack I mean is not the one on Cutter Road, though that one is real enough. The shack is what a person is left with when the visible things are gone. When the title and the house and the company and the formal role have been stripped away. What's in the shack is what's actually yours. What has always been yours. What can't be transferred or dissolved or surveyed or legally claimed. Most people never find out what's in their shack because the visible things never get taken from them. I found out. It turned out to be considerable. Carol knew. She knew for 30 years that the thing she was most attached to was not the house with her curtains, or the company with her name adjacent to it, or the Sunday dinners, or the comfortable security of a long marriage to a man who built things. She was attached to the work itself, the actual work of building something. She would have run this foundation better than all of us. I'm building it in her memory and with her principles, and I am learning, at 72, in a shack in Delwood County, something she already knew. Nathan is my son. He will always be my son. He did something that hurt me in ways I am still, if I'm being honest, not fully done feeling. That is also true. Both things are true and neither cancels the other. Love does not require the erasure of what happened. It requires the decision to remain present, despite it, to sit across the folding table from the person who hurt you and tell them the truth and hear the truth back and do the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding what was broken. The morning light comes in through the east window. Dell fixed the crack last fall, replaced the glass entirely, and now it lets the light in clean instead of through the distortion of old damaged panes. I sit at the folding table in the morning with my coffee, and I look at the documents, and I think about the day ahead and what it requires, which is usually honesty, patience, and the willingness to keep doing the work. The same things it has always required. The same things it will always require. It is enough. Every single morning, it is enough.